The village was starving, even though the granaries were full. There was grain, but no flour. The millstone's axle had cracked 6 months earlier, and it would take another 6 months to bring a new one across 2 borders. And then a vagabond arrived in the village, without money, without a name, without a memory. He looks at the broken wheel and says, "I'll fix it." And now let's rewind. Daniel opens his eyes under a strange gray sky. A light rain stings his face like cold needles. He's lying in a ditch and doesn't remember how he got there. His head is throbbing, as if someone inside his skull were hammering a rail with a sledgehammer. He sits up. The world is swaying. His hands sink into the wet clay up to his wrists. The first thing he sees is a wagon train, 4 carts, 8 oxen, 6 guards with halberds. The whole procession crawls along the muddy road so slowly it makes him want to scream. And the only thought pounding in his head isn't where he is or how he got here. All of this could have been transported in a single rail car in 2 hours. They wouldn't have gotten wet, and no one would have been killed along the way. He shakes his head. The field. The field. The muddy strip of road stretches toward the horizon. Not a single piece of metal on a rail. Nowhere. He says one word aloud. "All right." His voice sounds foreign. Then he adds 3 words. "So I have to lay down." The convoy crawls around the bend. The rain intensifies. Daniel Hunt sits in a roadside ditch in a strange world. Wet clothes, empty pockets, no documents, no notebook with drawings. He has nothing but 20 years of engineering school in his head. He stands up. His legs buckle. He stands up again. Ahead, beyond the convoy, the roofs of the village loom. He walks there because there's nowhere else to go. The boots aren't his. The pants aren't his. The shirt, soaked through, isn't his either. The last thing he remembers is a section of track after his shift. Evening. A freshly laid track. A sound behind him. And that's it. Then a ditch and rain. The village emerges closer than he thought. 24 thatched houses. A well. A church with a wooden wheel instead of a cross. And a mill on the edge. A large stone mill with a water wheel that stands motionless. The blades are overgrown with green moss. Water flows past in a useless stream. Someone calls out to him. An old man stands on the porch with a cane and looks at him like a vagrant, with and without pity. He asks who he is and where he's from. Daniel opens his mouth and realizes he understands the language. Not his own, a foreign one. But he makes out every word. He says he's come from the road, that he doesn't remember how he got here, that he needs a roof over his head and food, and he's ready to work. The old man snorts. There's no work. The mill stands idle. There's grain, but no flour. The village is starving despite full granaries because the wheel axle cracked 6 months ago, and ordering a new one means crossing 2 borders and waiting 6 months. Daniel looks at the mill, at the old man, back at the mill, and something familiar clicks in his head. Not magic, not a revelation from above, just 20 years of habit, seeing a breakdown and immediately figuring out how to fix it. He asks if there's a blacksmith. The old man nods. A carpenter? He nods again. Can I take a look inside the mill? The old man shrugs. Miller Tolbert won't mind. Tolbert doesn't care anymore. Tolbert turns out to be a heavy-set man in his 50s with a red face and empty eyes. He's sitting on a bench and doesn't even get up. He waves his hand. Take a look. Daniel goes inside. It smells of dampness and old, dried-out flour. He finds the axle, or rather, what's left of it. A solid oak shaft, as thick as a man's girth, has cracked along the grain. The crack runs from the middle almost to the edge. A shaft like this will fall apart at the very first turn. Daniel crouches down. He touches the wood. He pulls a stick out of the dirt and draws right on the dusty floor. He has no notebook. The floor will do. He draws and calculates in his head. A solid shaft can't be made here. There's no wood and no lathe. But who said the axle has to be solid? 4 oak beams, 3 iron strips, ties every 8 inches. Wood holds up under compression. The iron withstands tension. Together, They bear the same load as a solid shaft. Even better, if one section cracks, it can be replaced separately. He calculates the tolerances, the moments of force, the thickness of the strips. It all adds up. He goes outside and tells Tolbert he'll fix the axle. Tolbert looks up at him as if he's crazy. "Who are you?" "I'm an engineer." Tolbert doesn't know the word. "I'm a man who fixes things." "And what are you going to fix it with if they can't even bring an axle from the city?" "I don't need a new axle. I need a blacksmith and 3 iron strips and a carpenter and 4 oak beams." Tolbert is silent for a long time. Then he stands up and leads him to the blacksmith. The blacksmith's name is Bran, a broad, bearded man with hands like shovels. He listens and chimes in, "That's nonsense. A composite axle won't hold. No one's ever done it that way." Daniel asks why it won't hold. "Because it won't hold." "Have you ever seen a bridge break?" Bran shakes his head. "A bridge breaks not because the stone is weak. A bridge breaks because the forces aren't directed the right way. Direct the forces correctly, and you can build a bridge with half the stone. Same with the axle." Bran listens with a look on his face as if someone were explaining to him that the earth is round. But he listens. The carpenter's name is Alvin, skinny, silent. He looks at the drawing in the dust and doesn't say a word. He just goes into the workshop and starts hewing the beams. Daniel works for 3 days. The first day is spent hammering into Bran's head what thickness the strips need to be. Bran has been forging by eye his whole life, a different one every time. Daniel carves a template out of wood, 2 blocks with a slot exactly 1/4 of an inch wide. The strip has to fit through the slot. If it's too thick, it won't go through. If it's too thin, it wobbles. Bran stares at the template as if it were magic. He tries it. The first one won't fit. The second one fits. The third one fits. Bran grunts. It's a useful thing. Daniel thinks the caliper can wait. The dies will do for now. The second day is spent on assembly. Alvin has hewn the beams smoother than Daniel expected. The silent carpenter knows his craft. The beams slot into the grooves. Iron clamps around the wood. Ties pass through the drilled holes. Daniel tightens each one himself. He checks the gaps with his fingers. The third day is the hardest. The 4 of them drag the new axle into place. Daniel, Bran, Alvin, and Tolbert's son, a 17-year-old boy with frightened eyes. The axle is heavy. They strain their backs, but it stands up. Daniel opens the sluice gate. Water rushes onto the blades. The wheel shudders. It creaks and turns. The first rotation in 6 months. Tolbert stands in the doorway and watches the spinning wheel. Then he covers his face with his hands. His shoulders shake. His son stands nearby, not knowing what to do with his hands. Bran runs his fingers over the iron blades and says nothing. But Daniel sees how he's looking. Not with disbelief, with hunger. That's how a master looks when he suddenly realizes the world is bigger than his anvil. In the evening, Tolbert feeds Daniel. His first real meal in 3 days. Bread, porridge, a piece of salted pork. Daniel eats and thinks. If they don't know about the composite axle, then they know nothing. Not about standardization, not about load calculations, not about rails, or about steam pressure. They live in a world where every nail is as unique as a snowflake, and every bridge is built with a 10-fold safety margin because no one knows how to count. He sits at the miller's table with a full stomach and empty pockets, and thinks about rails, about how to lay the first rail in a world where there isn't a single rolling mill, where there is no steel, where grain rots in the south and people starve in the north because there are 4 borders and a 6-week journey between them. The next morning, he stays another day and measures everything he can. Measures with a rope, counts in steps, estimates angles by the shadow of a stick. No tape measure, no level, no set square. Just a head that knows how to count. He figures out 3 things. The river by the mill flows north toward the town of Brashear, a 4-day journey. In Brashear, there is a river port, and barges go downstream to the town of Colden. Between them lies a flat valley without mountains or swamps. Daniel closes his eyes and sees the route, straight as an arrow. 18 miles across flat land, 2 embankments, 1 bridge over a stream, no tunnels. a perfect first line. He opens his eyes. The sun sets over the village, a shade of orange slightly different from what he's used to. A foreign sun in a foreign world. He listens to the wheel turning, his wheel, and he thinks, if a single axle can feed a village, then a single line can feed a kingdom. In the morning, he leaves. Tolbert gives him food for the road. Bran gives him a knife. Alvin silently shakes his hand. Daniel heads north, toward Brashear, toward the river, toward the place where he will lay his first rail. The journey to Brashear took 4 days. 4 days through the mud. 4 days of rain that would ease off only to start again. Daniel walked and looked around. He memorized everything. The road's gradient, the width of the ruts left by the carts, the type of rock in the outcrops along the roadside, the depth of the wells in the villages where he stopped for the night. All of this was data. He couldn't write it down because he didn't have a notebook, but his mind was working. On the second day, he overtook the wagon train. 12 wagons loaded with coal. They were traveling from the southern province to Brashear. The driver of the lead wagon told him that this coal had set out 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks. During that time, a third of the cargo had spilled onto the road. 2 oxen had died. 1 wagon had been abandoned because a wheel had broken and no one on the road knew how to fix it. Daniel walked alongside the wagon train, doing the math in his head. 6 weeks on the road, 30% loss. The cost of security. The cost of feed for the oxen. The cost of the oxen themselves. Duties at 4 borders. By the time this coal reached Brashear, its price would have increased 5-fold. And that was considered normal. It had always been that way. It would always be that way. Unless they laid tracks. On the 3rd day, he passed through a small town called West Hill. Tiny, 100 houses, a market in the square. He stopped and listened. A merchant was arguing with a customer over the price of nails. 10 copper coins per pound of nails. Daniel asked the merchant where the nails were from. The merchant replied that they were from Brashear. Daniel asked how much they cost in Brashear. The merchant said 4 copper coins. A 2.5-fold difference for a single day's journey. Because of the road. Because of the toll. Because the driver wants to eat and his ox wants to eat. Daniel nodded and walked on. His head was buzzing with numbers. This world wasn't poor. This world was slow. And that slowness was killing him more surely than any war. On the 4th day, he saw Brashear. The city stood on a hill above the river. Stone walls, 3 towers, a port down by the water. Barges at the docks, smoke from the chimneys. Maybe 10,000 inhabitants, maybe 15. A real city. The first real city he had seen in this world. He entered through the north gate. The guards looked at him and let him pass without question. A vagrant in dirty clothes with no belongings was of no interest to them. Inside, the city turned out to be just as he had expected. Narrow streets, paved haphazardly, ditches instead of sewers. The smell, a buzz of voices, the market, the port, guild houses with coats of arms on their doors. Daniel walked through the entire city to the port. He wanted to see the river. The river was wide, about 100 meters. The current was slow, deep enough for barges. Along the bank stood wharves, wooden, old, some rotten. A man stood at one of the piers and was yelling at the workers, loudly, with feeling. The workers were trying to pull a barge ashore for repairs. The barge was aground and wouldn't budge. The man was large, about 50 years old, an expensive doublet smeared with mud, a red face. He was waving his arms and shouting that they were doing everything wrong. Daniel stopped and watched. He saw the problem. They were pulling the barge straight, head on. 10 men were pulling the rope, and the barge wouldn't budge because it was stuck on the clay bottom and had sucked itself fast. Daniel knew how to fix it. Any engineer knew. Don't pull straight. Rock it. First to the side, break the suction, then pull. He walked up to the shouting man and told him they were doing it wrong. The man turned to him and asked who he was. Daniel said he was an engineer and knew how to free the barge from the shallows. The man looked at his dirty clothes and asked what kind of engineer he was. Daniel didn't bother explaining. He asked for 5 minutes. If it didn't work, he'd leave. The man snorted and waved his hand. Go ahead. Daniel walked over to the workers. He asked them to split into 2 groups. 5 men on one rope, 5 on the other. Tie one rope to the bow of the barge, the other to the stern, and pull in turns, not at the same time. First the bow to the right, then the stern to the left, rocking it back and forth. The workers exchanged glances, but they did it. First tug, the barge creaked. Second tug, it shifted. Third, a squelching sound. The clay gave way. Fourth tug, and the barge started moving. It reached the shore in 2 minutes. A man in an expensive doublet stood there in silence. Then he approached Daniel and held out his hand. He introduced himself. Hans Markham, a merchant, owner of 3 barges and 2 warehouses in the port. He asked where Daniel had learned this. Daniel replied that he had studied under masters from across the sea. Markham nodded. He didn't believe him, but he didn't care. He was interested in the result. He asked if Daniel needed a job. Daniel replied that he did. Markham said he needed someone who knew about barges. His barges were leaking. His docks were rotting. His boatmen were stealing. He needed someone with a good head on their shoulders. He offered a salary, a roof over his head, food. Daniel agreed. That evening, for the first time in a week, he slept in a real bed, in a room above Markham's warehouse, small, cold, but with a roof. He lay there and thought. The first step was taken. He was in the city. He had a job. He had a roof over his head. Tomorrow, he would start. In the morning, he went down to Markham's office and met Elise. She was sitting at a desk piled high with papers. Her red hair was pulled back into a bun, a pen in her right hand. Her left hand was tapping on the desk. She was calculating. Daniel could tell by her eyes. She wasn't just writing down numbers. She was thinking them through. Markham had introduced her as his daughter. She was doing the bookkeeping. Elise looked up and glanced at Daniel, briefly, appraisingly, and went back to her papers. Markham had told her to show Daniel the barge accounts. She nodded without looking up. Daniel sat down next to her and began looking at the numbers. An hour later, he realized 3 things. First, Markham's barges weren't losing money because they were leaking. They were losing money because they were sailing half empty. The load factor was 40%. Markham sent a barge out when an order came in, not when the barge was full. Second, the docks weren't rotting from old age. They were rotting because they stood in stagnant water. If the dock were moved 200 paces downstream where the river flows faster, the wood would last 3 times as long. Third, Elise knew both of these things. It was evident from her notes. She underlined the relevant lines. She made notes in the margins. She read through alternative routes. But no one asked her. Daniel turned to her and asked why the barges were running half empty. She looked up. She looked at him. Then at her father, who was talking to someone in the doorway, then back at Daniel. And she answered, because her father doesn't want to wait. He's afraid the client will switch to another carrier if the barge doesn't leave on time. Daniel asked what if they made a schedule, a fixed one. The barge leaves every 3rd day, full or not. But everyone knows when it leaves and can plan accordingly. Elise dropped her pen. She looked at him, and he could see the pieces falling into place in her mind, what she'd been thinking about for months but hadn't been able to put into words. A schedule, regularity, predictability. She said it might work. Daniel said it would definitely work. He asked her for a blank sheet of paper and a pen and began to draw. Not a barge, not a dock. He drew a table, a schedule. 3 barges, 6 trips a week, load, cost, profit. Elise looked at the table, and her pen tapped on the table faster and faster. That meant she was thinking. Markham walked over and looked over her shoulder. He asked what it was. Daniel explained. Markham was silent for a long time. Then he said he'd give it a try. 2 weeks later, Markham's barges were running on schedule. The load factor rose from 40% to 70%. The merchants at the port stopped waiting and wondering when the next barge would leave. They knew. Every 3rd day. And they planned accordingly. Markham earned more in those 2 weeks than in the previous 2 months. He looked at Daniel with new eyes. Daniel, meanwhile, was repairing the barges. He found that the bottoms were leaking not because of poor wood, but because of poor caulking. The caulkers at the port stuffed the tow as best they could. Daniel showed them how to do it right, in even rows, with equal pressure, checking every seam. The 3 barges stopped leaking. Markham saved so much on repairs that he doubled Daniel's pay. A month passed. Daniel worked for Markham during the day, and in the evenings, he drew. On every scrap of paper he could get his hands on. He drew railroad tracks. He drew railroad ties. He drew switches and signal semaphores. He drew things that no one in this world had ever seen. And he drew a map. From Brashear to Colden. 18 miles through a flat valley. His first line. One evening, Elise came into his room to bring him the bills, and she saw the drawings. They were spread out all over the floor. She stood in the doorway and looked. Then she picked up a sheet. It was a drawing of a rail joint. She asked what it was. Daniel was silent. He didn't know how to explain. He couldn't tell the truth. He couldn't say that he was from another world where things like that lay under every train. He said it was his project, a road made of iron, on which carts travel quickly and smoothly, without mud, without ruts, in any weather. Elise looked at him, then at the drawing, then at him again, and asked the only right question. How much does it cost? Daniel smiled. Because of all the questions a person who saw a drawing of a rail for the first time in their life, this was the most appropriate one. He said he didn't know exactly, but he could calculate it, if she helped with the numbers. Elise sat down on the floor next to him, right on top of the drawings, and they calculated until dawn. Daniel made his way to Brashear and found work with the merchant Hans Markham. He optimized the barge's operations using a schedule and increased their load capacity from 40 to 70%. Elise Markham saw the railroad blueprints and became the first person in the world to whom Daniel told about his project. They calculated for 3 nights. Elise would come after her father had gone to bed. She brought candles and ledgers. She sat on the floor among the blueprints and calculated. Daniel called out the figures, the length of the line, the number of ties per mile, the weight of the rail per foot, the cost of the iron, the cost of labor, the cost of the land. Elise converted all of this into local currency, into real prices, into the real economy. By the end of the 3rd night, they had a budget. 18 miles of track from Brashear to Colden. The total cost was so high that Eliza put down her pen and said it was impossible. Her father didn't have that kind of money. Daniel said he didn't need all the money at once. He needed money for the first mile. 1 mile of track, rails, sleepers, ballast. 1 mile to show that it works. After that, the money would come on its own. Eliza asked how he knew that. Daniel replied that people don't believe words. People believe their eyes. When they see a grain wagon travel a mile in 10 minutes on iron rails instead of 3 hours through the mud, the money will be found. Elise tapped her pen on the table. She thought, and said she would talk to her father. The conversation with Markham took place the next day. Daniel laid out the blueprints on the desk in the office. Markham looked at them and didn't understand a thing. Daniel explained. Iron rails, wooden sleepers across them, a wagon with wheels that run on these rails, not on the ground, not on the mud, on the iron. Markham asked why. Daniel said, 1 horse on the rails pulls as much as 4 horses on the road. Markham looked up. He was a merchant. He understood numbers. 4 to 1. That meant the cost of transport dropped by a factor of 4. He asked how much it would cost for the first mile. Elise named the figure. Markham was silent for a long time. Then he said it was a lot, but not crazy. He'd seen how Daniel had doubled the profits of his barges in a month. He'd seen the schedule. He'd seen the barges that had stopped leaking. This strange man who'd come out of nowhere was doing what he'd promised. Markham said yes, but on one condition. If the first mile didn't show results, Daniel would work off every penny invested in the barges, down to the last copper. Daniel agreed. He knew the first mile would show results. The next day he went to the city council. He needed land. a strip of land 20 feet wide from the eastern gate toward Colden. The council consisted of 7 people, 3 merchants, 2 landowners, 1 representative of the Carriers Guild, and the mayor. Daniel spoke with them for an hour. He drew on the board. He explained. He showed the numbers. 3 of the 7 looked at him as if he were mad. 2 as if he were a swindler. The representative of the Carriers Guild looked at him with hatred. Only the burgomaster listened. His name was Aldrich, an old, thin man with a sharp nose and watchful eyes. He asked one question. What would happen to the coachman? Daniel replied that nothing would happen in the first phase. The line was short. 1 mile. Experimental. It wouldn't replace the coachman. It would demonstrate the possibility. Aldrich nodded and voted in favor. 2 others voted in favor. The guild representative voted against it. The final vote was 4-3. Daniel received the land, a strip 20 feet wide and 1 mile long, free of charge, for 2 years. After that, he would have to pay rent or return the land. Now he needed rails, and for the rails, he needed a blacksmith. Not a village blacksmith like Bran. He needed a city blacksmith with a large forge and heavy hammers. He found Brasher's blacksmith quarter on the south side of the city. A dozen smithies, the clang of hammers from morning till night. He went around to all of them. In each one he asked the same thing. Could the blacksmith make an iron strip 10 feet long, 2 inches thick, and 4 inches wide, and make 10 such strips, all identical? Identical. Every blacksmith reacted the same way. First, he nodded. I can make a bar. Then they frowned. I can't make 10 identical ones. Why do they have to be identical? Every bar has its own shape. Iron is alive. Daniel explained why they had to be identical. Because wheels would run on them. If one bar is higher than another, the wheel will come off. If one is wider than another, the cart will get stuck. Every bar must be like a sister twin of the one before it. The blacksmiths looked at him as if he were a heretic. In the last smithy he visited, he found what he was looking for. Not a blacksmith's daughter. The smithy was run by Master's son, a broad-shouldered, silent man from the eastern province of Heran. His daughter Jiwoo stood in the corner of the smithy and pretended to be sweeping. But Daniel saw. He saw her hands, her scorched forearms, the calluses on her palms, not from a broom, from a hammer. He saw the nails on the workbench in the corner, straight, neat, identical, not like her father's, better. He picked up one nail, turned it between his fingers, picked up another, compared them. They were identical, not just roughly, exactly, same length, same thickness, same head. He turned to Jiwoo and asked, "Did you make these?" She froze with the broom in her hands. Master's son stood with his back to them. She nodded, quickly, fearfully. Daniel asked how she managed to make them all the same. She said she used a scrap of iron pipe as a gauge. She cuts the wire to the length of the pipe, the same length every time. Then she shapes it. Daniel looked at her and saw an engineer. She didn't know that word. She didn't know what standardization was, but she did it, intuitively, on her own, because that's the right way. He told her he wanted to hire her, officially, with a salary, a rail-rolling foreman. Foreman's son turned around. His face darkened. He said his daughter wasn't a worker. She was a girl, and her business was the home and her husband. Daniel said her nails were better than any he'd seen in the whole city. Master's son said it didn't matter. Daniel asked why it didn't. Master's son stepped toward him, and Daniel realized the conversation was over. He left. But the next morning, Jiwoo was standing at the door of Markham's office, with a bundle in her hands. She said she had run away from home. She wanted to work. Daniel looked at Elise. Elise looked at Jiwoo, then at Daniel, and said they had a spare room in the warehouse. Jiwoo bowed and went inside. Now Daniel had a master. He needed a forge. Markham rented him an old shed by the pier. Daniel and Jiwoo rebuilt it in a week. A furnace, an anvil, a hammer, and most importantly, a rolling mill. The simplest kind, 2 cast iron rollers that Daniel had ordered from a foundry on the other side of town, a frame made of oak beams, a feed lever. The principle was simple. A red-hot iron billet is passed between the rolls. The rolls press down. The billet is drawn out into a strip. One shape, one thickness, every time. Jiu looked at the mill and her eyes burned. She understood. She understood it at first glance, not because Daniel had explained it, because she herself thought the same way. Identical, repetitive, correct. They rolled the first rail a month later. It was crooked, the thickness varied, the surface was pitted. Daniel looked at it and said it was junk. Jiwoo looked at it and said it was the first one. She was right. They redid the rolls. Daniel recalculated the clearances. He drew the roll profile with exact dimensions. The foundryman cast new ones. The second rail was better. The third was even better. By the end of the second month, they were rolling 2 rails a day, straight, smooth, identical, 10 feet each. Daniel would take 2 rails, place them side by side, and check them. The gap along the entire length was no wider than a fingernail. Jiu stood nearby and looked at the gap with an expression as if she were checking the straightness of a blade. For her, it had become a matter of honor. Every rail that came out of the mill with a deviation greater than the allowable limit, she sent back into the furnace. The blacksmiths of Brashear came to watch. They stood in the barn doorway and said nothing. They saw the same strip coming out of the furnace, time after time, identical. To them, it was sorcery. To Daniel, it was a rolling mill. Master Sun came 2 weeks after Jiwoo left. He stood in the doorway and watched his daughter. She was working at the mill, her sleeves rolled up, her face red from the heat, sweat on her forehead. She didn't see him. She was busy. Master Sun stood and watched for a long time. Then he turned to Daniel and said he wanted to work. Daniel said he needed a blacksmith for tie rods and crutches. Master Sun nodded and stayed. He didn't say a word to his daughter that day. But the next morning she found a leather apron, new, tailored to her size, with her initials. Only one person in this town could have made that apron. Ji-oo put it on and said nothing, but Daniel noticed that she worked with her eyes closed that day for a moment longer than usual when she drank water. Daniel convinced Markham to invest in the first mile of the railroad and obtained land from the city council. He found Ji-oo's son, who intuitively understood standardization, and hired her as a rolling mill foreman. They built a rolling mill, and by the end of the second month were producing smooth, uniform rails. The rails were ready. Now they needed a track. Daniel left through the eastern gate of Brashear early in the morning of the 3rd month. With him were Ji-oo and 12 workers hired by Markham. Daniel carried a rope, a plumb line, and a homemade instrument he put together over 3 evenings from a brass tube and 2 pieces of glass, a crude theodolite. Not a real one, but good enough to measure angles to within half a degree. He set it on a tripod made of sticks. He looked through the glass and began to mark out the line. A 20-foot wide strip of land ran from the gate toward Colden. Flat land, meadows, short grass. 1 river 3 miles away. 1 ravine 5 miles away. The rest was flat. Daniel walked along, driving in stakes, every 100 feet. The workers pulled a rope between the stakes, a straight line, a full mile long. They staked out the first mile in a day. Daniel stood at the end of the line and looked back. The stakes stretched toward the city walls in a straight line, like seams on fabric, like railroad ties that weren't there yet, but would be. The next day, work began. The embankment, the most tedious and the most important part. Daniel explained to the workers. The ground under the rails had to be firm and level, not just level to the eye, level according to the level. He showed them the level, a wooden slat with a groove in the middle, water in the groove. If the water stands still, the surface is level. If it runs to one edge, you need to add soil on the other side. The workers looked at the level with interest. A simple thing, easy to understand. They dug, hauled soil in wheelbarrows, tamped it down. Daniel walked along the embankment and checked every section, with the level, with a string, with his feet. He could feel the unevenness through the soles of his shoes, a habit from his past life. From that section where he had last inspected the freshly laid track. The work was moving slowly. 12 men for a whole mile is nothing. Daniel understood that, but there wasn't money for more. Markham had given as much as he could. Every evening, Elise came with a report. How much had been spent today? How much was left? how many days they could hold out. The numbers were bad. The money was running out faster than the embankment was growing. Daniel calculated and recalculated. He looked for ways to save. He found one: the ties. In his world, ties were standard: edged timber of a specific size, impregnated with creosote. There was no creosote here, but there were oak forests around Brashear, and there were lumberjacks who cut oak for construction and sold it at the price of lumber. Daniel went to the lumber market. He found a merchant who sold offcuts, short pieces of oak that were good for neither beams nor planks. Trash. The merchant was selling them for firewood. Daniel bought the entire stock for a quarter of the price of lumber. He brought it to the site. The workers sawed the scraps to size: 6 feet long, 6 inches thick, rough, but enough. They made railroad ties out of trash, out of what others considered trash. Elise noted the savings and underlined the figure twice. It was at that very moment that another person appeared in Daniel's life. He came on his own. Or rather, she did. A young woman covered in road dust, with a leather case on her back and 5 pencils in her belt. Brass-rimmed glasses, dark hair pulled back in a braid. She approached Daniel at the site and said she'd heard he was building a road out of iron. Daniel said yes. She said she was a cartographer. Her name is Che Ha-un. She came from Head-on. She wants to work. Daniel asked why she had left from Head-on. Ha-un answered briefly. They don't hire female cartographers there. Daniel asked if she could draw a map of the area from Brashear to Colden, with elevations, with slopes, with ground elevations. Ha-un opened the tube and took out the map. She had already drawn it, before she arrived, just in case it might come in handy. Daniel unfolded the map on the ground and sat down. He looked at it for a minute. 2, 3. The map was flawless. He could tell at a glance. The river lines were precise. The contours were correct. The elevation marks were placed exactly where they should be. It wasn't a map. It was a survey. Ha-in had done his job for him, without knowing she was doing his job, simply because she'd drawn it correctly. He looked up and said one sentence to her. You draw correctly. Everyone else draws incorrectly. Ha-in stood there in silence. Then she adjusted her glasses. Then she turned away. Daniel noticed her shoulders tremble, just a little bit. He hired her that very day. Now there were 4 of them: Daniel, Elise, Jiwoo, Ha-in, and 12 workers. 3 things happened in the 3rd month. First, the embankment reached half a mile. The rails began to be laid on the ties, the first rail, then the second, then the third. Jiwoo personally checked every joint. The tampers struck the ties with a dull thud. Iron on wood. To Daniel, that sound became the sound of progress. Second, the Carriers Guild sent a man, a young clerk with a document. The document stated that the construction of the railroad violated the guild's privileges for the transport of goods within the jurisdiction of Brashear. Daniel read the paper and asked the clerk where exactly in the guild's charter it mentioned railroads. The clerk hesitated. Nowhere. Railroads didn't exist when the charter was written. Daniel returned the paper and said he would be happy to discuss the matter once a relevant clause appeared in the charter. The clerk left. That was the first skirmish, not last. The third. Ha-in found a problem. She came to Daniel that evening with a map on which a section 4 miles from Brashear was marked in red pencil. A ravine. Daniel knew about it, but Ha-in showed him something he hadn't seen. The ravine was widening. Spring waters were eroding the eastern slope. In 2 or 3 years, there would be a 40-foot wide gully at that spot. If they built the track along the edge of the ravine as Daniel had planned, the track would collapse in 2 years. They would either have to go around it or build a bridge. Going around meant an extra 1.5 miles. Extra ties, extra rails, extra money they didn't have. A bridge meant stone, a lot of stone, and masons, whom they also didn't have. Daniel looked at the map. Ha-in stood nearby and waited. She didn't offer solutions. She pointed out the problem, precisely and without unnecessary words. Daniel thought all night. By morning, he had a solution. Not a detour, not a stone bridge, a wooden trestle on oak piles, driven into the bottom of the ravine, with a truss made of timber fastened with iron bolts. A structure he had calculated in his head overnight. Lightweight, cheap, strong enough for horse-drawn traffic, not strong enough for a steam locomotive. But the locomotive wouldn't be coming tomorrow. First, horse-drawn transport. First, prove that it works. He sketched the trestle on a sheet of paper. He showed it to Ha-In. She looked at it and asked if the oak would hold. Daniel said it would hold if the piles were set correctly. He drew up the calculations. Load per pile, beam cross-section, drive depth. Ha-Un looked at the numbers and her pencil moved across the map. She was already sketching the overpass onto the drawing, fitting it into the terrain, adjusting the route so the approach to the ravine was at the right angle. They worked together in silence. 2 hours. 3. Daniel realized they didn't need words. He was drawing the structure. She was anchoring it to the ground, as if they'd done it 1,000 times. Elise came in that morning and saw them bent over the map. She brought breakfast, bread and cheese. She set it on the edge of the table. She looked at the drawing of the overpass. She asked how much it would cost. Daniel named a figure. Elise shook her head. They didn't have enough. Daniel said he knew. Markham would have to invest more. Elise said her father was already at his limit. He believed in the project, but his patience wasn't infinite. There were no results yet, just expenses. Daniel said there would be results in a month. 1 mile of track, the first test run, horse-drawn, a wagon with grain. From the Brayshire Gate to the first mile of track. If that didn't convince Markham, nothing would. Elise was silent. Then she nodded. She would talk to her father. Markham gave the money, his last. He came to the site in person and looked at the rails lying on the ties. He touched the iron with his hand. It was cold and smooth. He said he'd never seen anything like it. Daniel replied that he'd soon see something even better. The 4th month. The embankment was ready. The rails were laid for a mile. Daniel stood at the start of the track and looked along the rails. 2 parallel lines stretched out ahead, shining in the morning sun. Straight. He felt no pride. He felt impatience. 1 mile out of 18. The beginning of the track. Nothing more. He turned to Jiwoo and said, "Give me the cart." Daniel began construction of the first mile of track. Cartographer Ha-Un joined the team and discovered a problem with a ravine, for which Daniel devised a solution in the form of a wooden trestle. By the end of the 4th month, 1 mile of track had been laid and was ready for the first test run. The cart was built by Alvin, a carpenter whom Daniel had summoned from the village. Alvin arrived 5 days after receiving the letter, silent as always, with his tools in a bag on his back. He looked at the rails and said nothing. Then he touched the iron. Then he crouched down and looked along the track the way one looks down the barrel of a gun, checking for levelness. He stood up, nodded, and asked what wheels were needed. Daniel drew a picture. A wheel with a flange, a protrusion on the inner side of the rim that prevents the wheel from slipping off the rail. A simple thing. But in this world, no one had ever made such a thing. Alvin made the wheels in 3 days, wooden, with cast iron rims that Jay based on Daniel's design. A flange on every wheel, 4 wheels, 2 axles, an oak frame, a platform for cargo. The cart was ready by the end of the week. Rough, heavy, like a box on wheels, but it stood on the rails and didn't fall over. Daniel pushed it with his hand. The cart moved, easily, almost effortlessly. It rolled 10 feet and stopped. Daniel pushed again, 20 feet. Iron on iron, minimal friction. Alvin watched and said nothing. Then he said one word. Good. The test run was scheduled for the next morning. Daniel didn't sleep that night. Not from excitement, from calculations. He lay in bed and did the math in his head. The weight of the cart, the weight of the cargo, the horse's pulling force, rolling resistance, the gradient on the last 100 feet. It all added up. But it added up in his head, and the world had a habit of arguing with the head. The morning turned out to be sunny, the first sunny morning in 2 weeks. People gathered at the start of the route. Markham, Elise, Jiwoo, Ha-In, Master Sun, Alvin, 12 laborers, and about 20 onlookers from town who had heard about the strange iron strips beyond the eastern gate. The cart stood on the rails. 10 sacks of grain lay on it, 500 pounds. That was usually the load carried by a single cart drawn by 2 oxen. Daniel tied the reins to a single horse, just one. Markham asked if that wasn't too few. Daniel said it was just right. The driver tugged on the reins. The horse took a step. The reins tightened, and the cart moved. It moved so easily that the horse didn't even strain. At a walk, calmly, as if it were pulling an empty cart rather than half a ton of grain. The iron wheels hummed along the rails, a low, steady sound. Daniel heard it, and something in his chest stirred. He knew that sound. He had heard it 1,000 times in a past life. At stations and junctions and on the open road, the sound of wheels on rails, the very same one. The cart covered a mile in 8 minutes, at a walk. 1 horse, 500 pounds, 8 minutes. On a regular road, the same horse with the same load would have taken an hour, with 2 oxen. Markham stood at the end of the track and watched the cart approach. His face changed. Daniel saw the merchant calculating, not numbers, possibilities. 1 horse instead of 2 oxen, 8 minutes instead of an hour, in any weather. No mud, no ruts. Markham turned to Daniel and said 2 words, "Keep building." The onlookers stood in silence. Then one of them walked up to the rail and touched it with his foot, as if checking to see if it would disappear. Another walked up to the cart and peered under it. He examined the wheels, the fender, the axle. He didn't understand what he was seeing, but he could tell it worked. By evening, the whole of Brashear knew about the cart. The next day, 30 more people came to the site to apply for work. Labor was no longer a problem. The problem was money. Markham had invested everything he could. To continue construction, other sources of funding were needed. Daniel was thinking about this when Elise approached him. She said that after yesterday's demonstration, 3 merchants from the port had come to see her. Each wanted to know how much it would cost to transport cargo by rail. Each wanted to know when the line would reach Colden. And each asked if they could invest in the construction. Daniel looked at her. She was smiling. It was the first time he'd seen her smile. Not politely, not professionally, genuinely. She said she'd put together a proposal for investors, a share of the future line's profits in exchange for investment in the construction. Daniel asked when she'd found the time. Elise replied that it was last night. While he was calculating the loads, she was counting the money. They looked at each other, and Daniel thought that for the first time in this world, he wasn't alone. Not just not alone, he was with people who thought ahead. A week later, they had 3 investors. 2 weeks later, 5. There was enough money to continue construction to the 10th mile. Work was in full swing. 30 workers were digging the embankment. Jiwoo and Master Sun were laying the rails. Alvin was building ties and carts. Ha-In was laying out the route further ahead. She would leave at dawn with a compass and a measuring tape and return at dusk with a new section of the map. Every evening, the 4 of them would sit together, Daniel, Elise, Ha-In, Jiwoo, over the map and the numbers. Daniel would say what needed to be built. Elise said how much it would cost. Ha-In said exactly where. Jiwoo said what materials to use. They argued, sometimes quietly, sometimes loudly. Ha-In once said that the route through the western meadow was better than through the eastern one because the ground was firmer. Daniel said the eastern route was half a mile shorter. Ha-In said the western route didn't need an embankment. The savings on earthwork would offset the extra half mile of track. Daniel opened his mouth to object. He looked at the map. He looked at the numbers Elise was already entering into the table, and he shut his mouth. Ha-In was right. He told her so. She adjusted her glasses and said nothing, but her pencil moved faster. The 5th month. The 6th. The line was growing, mile after mile. The rails were laid on the ties. The ties were laid on the embankment. The embankment stretched forward like a long brown snake through the green valley. At the 3rd mile, they reached a ravine. It took 2 weeks to build the overpass. The piles were driven by hand, with a heavy wooden pile driver. 10 men hoisted the pile driver on ropes and dropped it. The pile sank an inch into the ground. They hoisted it again. They dropped it again. hundreds of blows for each pile. Daniel worked alongside the laborers. He pulled the rope. His hands were covered in bloody calluses. Jiwoo worked beside him. She didn't complain. Master Sun watched his daughter and said nothing. The overpass stood, 20 feet above the bottom of the ravine, 40 feet long. Oak piles, oak beams, iron ties. The truss structure that Daniel had calculated on paper and that now stood in reality. The first cart crossed the trestle in complete silence. No one was breathing. The wood creaked, but it held. The cart passed. The workers exhaled. Someone laughed nervously. Daniel stood below, looking up at the trestle. It held. His calculations were correct. He allowed himself a smile, a small one, a quick one. In the 7th month, the line reached the 10-mile mark, halfway to Colden. And that's when the problems started. Not technical ones, human ones. A representative of the Carriage Drivers Guild had come again. This time, not a clerk. This time, the Lord Protector himself, Garrick Vaughn. He arrived in a carriage drawn by a team of 4 horses, with a guard of 10 horsemen. He was tall and heavy, 60 years old, a graying beard, eyes like 2 dark stones. He stepped out of the carriage and walked along the tracks, slowly, intently. He touched the rail with his hand. He crouched down and looked at the joints. Then he straightened up and turned to Daniel. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He spoke quietly and calmly. He said he had 80,000 people under his command. Coachmen, guards, grooms, farriers, saddlers, wheelwrights, and their families. 250,000 souls who made their living from the road, from an ordinary road, with wheels and horses and mud. He asked Daniel what would happen to these people when his iron tracks reached Colden. Daniel was silent. He knew the answer. And the answer was a bad one. Garrick said he knew the answer too. They would lose their jobs. First the drivers on this route, then on the next, then on all of them. He said that Daniel wasn't building a road. He was building a knife that would cut off the bread from 250,000 mouths. Daniel replied that he would find them other work. Garrick asked what kind. Daniel said the railroad itself would create thousands of jobs. Track workers, engineers, firemen, station workers, warehouse workers, maintenance workers. Garrick shook his head. He said 1,000 new jobs wouldn't make up for 10,000 lost ones. He said that even if they did, it wouldn't happen right away. But the coachmen are starving right now. Their children are starving right now. He said he'd heard these promises before. From people who built bridges where there used to be ferries. From people who dug canals where there used to be trails. Everyone promised things would get better. Every time, it was better for those at the top and worse for those at the bottom. Daniel listened. He couldn't argue, because Garrick was right. Not entirely, but enough. Progress always came at a price, and the price was paid by those who hadn't asked for progress. Garrick said he wouldn't burn his tracks, not yet, but he would file a lawsuit in the royal court, and he would speak to every merchant in Brayshire and every town all the way to Colden. He would tell them that the railroad was not the future. It was the death of the old world, and he would ask them if they were willing to pay that price. He got into his carriage and drove away. Daniel stood by the tracks and watched him go. Elise came over and stood beside him. She asked what he was going to do. Daniel said he would build and think, because Garrick had asked the right question, and that question needs the right answer, not someday, now. Elise nodded. Then she said quietly that Garrick wasn't just the head of the guild. He was the secret treasurer of House Calder, the most powerful house in the north. And if the Calders decide the railroad isn't profitable for them, no court will help. The rails will simply vanish one night, along with whoever laid them. Daniel looked at her. She wasn't joking. He turned toward the rails and placed his palm on the cold iron. It was smooth under his fingers. Real. His work. His road. 18 miles he had to finish, and 250,000 people he had to answer to. He took his hand away and walked back to the workers. The embankment wouldn't build itself. The first test run on a single mile of track showed that one horse on the rails replaced 2 oxen on the road. Investors began pouring in money and construction accelerated. At the 10th mile, Daniel was visited by Garrick Vaughan, head of the Carriage Drivers Guild and secret treasurer of the House of Calder. He asked a question Daniel could not yet answer. What would become of the 250,000 people who would lose their jobs? The 10th mile, the halfway point. Daniel stood at the edge of the embankment and looked ahead. The valley stretched toward the horizon. Somewhere out there was Colden, the river port, the terminus of the first line. Another 8 miles. 2 months of work if all went well. Nothing went well. The next morning, 3 of the 5 investors sent letters, identical in meaning. They were withdrawing their investments. No reason given. Elise brought the letters to Daniel and placed them on the table. Her face was pale. She said she had spoken with one of them, a merchant named Torvald. Torvald said a man from Garrick Vaughan had come to see him. The man wasn't threatening. He simply explained that the Carriers Guild had been doing business with Torvald for 20 years, that his goods traveled on the Guild's roads under the Guild's protection, that if Torvald continued to invest in the railroad, the Guild would not be able to guarantee the safety of his cargo. Not a threat, just a fact. Torvald did the math and decided the railroad wasn't worth the risk. The other 2 investors received similar visits. Daniel sat at the table and looked at the numbers. Without the 3 investors, they had enough money left for 2 weeks of work. 2 weeks. Then there would be nothing to pay the workers with. Then there would be nothing to buy iron with. Then construction would grind to a halt. Elise weighed the options. Cut the workforce in half. Slow down production. Switch to a single shift. Daniel shook his head. If they slowed down, people would decide the project was dying, and it would die, because in this world, faith meant no less than steel. He stood up and went to see Markham. Markham was sitting in his office drinking wine. In the middle of the day. That was a bad sign. Daniel told him straight out, "We're running out of money. The investors have pulled out. We need a new source." Markham said he had nothing left. He'd put everything into it. The house, the barges, the warehouses. If the line didn't work, he'd be ruined. His daughter would be destitute. He said this without anger, with weariness. Daniel asked if there was anyone in Brayshire rich enough and bold enough. Markham thought for a long time. Then he named a name. Lady Sage Calder Wynne. Daniel asked again. Calder. Markham nodded. The 3rd daughter of the House of Calder, married into the minor barony of Wynne, widowed, returned. She lives on the family estate north of Brayshire. She has her own money from her late husband, and a mind of her own. Markham said she's not like her family. The House of Calder is war and land and the old ways. Sage is calculation and patience and the long game. Daniel asked how to get to her. Markham said he didn't know. She doesn't receive merchants, she receives equals, and she has no equals in Brayshire. Daniel thought about it all evening. The next morning, he asked Ju to do. She looked at the drawing and raised her eyebrows. Then she smiled, and she got to work. 3 days later, Daniel stood at the gates of Calder Wynne Manor. He was with Elise, and he held a wooden box in his hands. The gatekeeper said the lady wasn't receiving visitors. Daniel asked him to pass the box to her, with a note. The note contained a single sentence, "For your sons." They waited at the gate for an hour, 2. The gatekeeper returned and said the lady would receive them. The estate turned out to be large, a 3-story stone house, a garden, stables, servants in livery. Lady Sage met them in the parlor. She was tall, slender. Her dark hair was pulled back under a pearl-studded hairnet. Her face was beautiful and cold as a winter morning. She spoke in Imperial English with a slight northern accent. On the table in front of her stood Daniel's open box. Inside the box was a model, a small steam locomotive, 6 inches long, a brass body, a tiny boiler, a tiny pipe, 4 wheels on a track a foot long. The model worked. Not on steam, It ran on alcohol. A small burner under the boiler heated the water. Steam went into a tiny cylinder. The piston moved the connecting rod, the wheels turned, and the little locomotive traveled along the small tracks, slowly, with a creak. But it was moving. 2 boys were kneeling in front of the table, watching intently. One was 6, the other was 4. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just watched as the little locomotive traveled along the tracks, puffing out tiny wisps of steam. Then the younger one laughed, quietly, as if afraid to scare it away. And the older one laughed too. Lady Sage looked at her children, not at the train, at the children. Daniel saw her face. The cold left him. Not completely, but enough. She turned to him and asked what it was. Daniel explained. A steam engine. Fire heats the water. The water turns into steam. The steam pushes the piston. The piston turns the wheels. No horses, no oxen. Just fire and water and iron. Lady Sage was silent. She looked at the model, then at Daniel, then back at the model. She asked why he had come. Daniel told the truth. He needed money. He was building an iron road from Brashear to Colden. 10 miles are complete. 8 remain. Investors have backed out under pressure from the Carriage Drivers Guild. Without new investment, construction will grind to a halt. Lady Sage asked why he had come to her, to the daughter of House Calder, to a family that considers him an enemy. Daniel replied that he hadn't come to see Calder's daughter. He had come to see a woman who had a mind of her own, and her own money, and her children, who had just laughed for the first time in a long while. Lady Sage fell silent for a long time, Elise quiet and did not interfere. She understood that this conversation was not about money. It was about trust. Lady Sage said she wanted to see the road. Daniel said he would show her tomorrow. The next day, Lady Sage arrived at the estate in a closed carriage, with 2 servants and her 2 sons. The boys jumped out of the carriage and ran toward the tracks. The servants tried to stop them. Lady Sage stopped the servants. Daniel led her along the line. He pointed to the embankment. He pointed to the ties. He pointed to the rails and how they were fastened. He showed her the overpass across the ravine. Lady Sage touched the iron with her hands. She stepped on the ties. She peered under the rails. She didn't ask silly questions. She asked about the cost per mile, about the rail's service life, about load capacity, about the schedule, about payback. Elise answered the numbers. Daniel answered the technical questions. Hyan showed a map of the entire route to Colden. Jiyu showed her the rolling mill and explained how rails are made. Lady Sage listened to Jiyu particularly closely. A young woman of 20 who runs the foundry. That interested her more than the numbers. Then Daniel offered her a ride. The wagon stood on the tracks, a single horse in harness. Lady Sage looked at the wagon, at her silk skirts, at the wagon again. Then she lifted her skirts and climbed onto the platform. Elise helped her sit down. The boys climbed up after her, squealing with delight. The driver urged the horse on. The wagon set off. Lady Sage sat upright. The wind blew in her face. The rails hummed beneath the wheels. The fields flew by. The boys shouted with joy. And Daniel saw Lady Sage Calderwin's smile. For a single second. Quickly. Almost imperceptibly. But he saw it. They returned 20 minutes later. Lady Sage stepped down from the wagon. She smoothed her hair. She turned to Daniel and named a sum, twice what he had asked for. Daniel asked why twice. She replied that she wanted the line to be completed quickly, before her father found out where the money had come from. Elise looked at Daniel. He looked at Elise. They both understood the same thing. Lady Sage wasn't just investing money. She was betting against her own family, and she knew exactly what she was doing. The money arrived 2 days later. Construction continued. There were now 50 workers. A mile of track was laid each week. The 11th mile, the 12th, the 13th. Daniel worked from dawn to dusk. Ha-In walked ahead with a measuring rope and a compass, marking out the route for the week ahead. Ji-Woo didn't leave the foundry shed. Master Sun forged tie rods and crutches silently and without stopping. Elise sat in the office and kept the books, which were becoming more complicated with each passing day. 14th mile, 15th. At the 16th mile, the first accident occurred. A cart loaded with ballast stone derailed the tracks at a joint. The joint split open. The rails splayed apart. The cart fell on its side. The stones spilled out. 2 workers were injured. No one was killed. But Daniel stood over the overturned cart and his hands were shaking. Not from fear, from anger at himself. He knew the joints were a weak spot. He knew more reliable connections were needed. He knew, and he didn't do it. Because he was in a hurry. Because money was running out. Because every day of downtime was costly. He was in a hurry and nearly killed people. He halted construction for 3 days. He redesigned the joint. Instead of a simple end-to-end joint, he added a plate, an iron plate with 4 bolts holding the 2 rails together. Simple. Reliable. He should have done this from the start. GU manufactured 500 plates in a week. The workers went the entire length of the line from the beginning and installed plates at every joint. 3 days lost, but not a single joint that could come apart. D. Daniel jotted this down on a scrap of paper. Don't rush. People are more important than the schedule. He pinned the paper to the wall above his bed. 17th mile, 18th. Colden appeared on the horizon. A small town on the riverbank. Docks, warehouses, barges, the smell of fish and tar. The tracks reached the outskirts of Colden at the end of the 9th month, 18 miles, from the Brashier gates to the Colden docks. Daniel stood at the end of the line and looked back. 2 gleaming strips stretched toward the horizon. His line, the first railroad in this world. Elise stood to his right, Ha-Un to his left, Ji-Woo behind him. Behind them stood 50 workers, Master Sun, Alvin, Markham. No one said a word. They just stood there, looking at the tracks. The line was operational. Every day, grain wagons traveled from Colden to Brashier and back. 3 hours instead of 2 days. 1 horse instead of 4 oxen. The merchants of Brashier did the math and couldn't believe their calculations. Transportation costs had dropped by a factor of 4. Grain that had been rotting in Colden's warehouses because it was too expensive to transport now reached Brashier fresh. The price of bread in the city had fallen by 1/3. Elise kept the books and showed Daniel a report every week. Revenues were growing. New orders came in every day. Merchants who used to send their goods by wagon were now lining up for a spot on the train. The line was operating at full capacity just a month after opening. Daniel looked at the numbers and saw a problem. Horsepower had its limits. A horse pulls a certain weight at a certain speed. There are 2 ways to increase cargo throughput: more carts and more horses, or a different kind of power, steam. He had been thinking about this from day 1. But a steam boiler isn't a model kit for Lady Sage's children. It's real pressure, real iron, real risk. He began designing the boiler at the end of the 9th month. He drew at night by candlelight. A cylindrical body, a water jacket, a firebox inside, smoke tubes, a steam valve. Every detail required calculation: pressure, temperature, wall thickness, seam strength. He knew the principles. But it's one thing to know the principle, and another to build a working boiler out of metal cast in a medieval town's foundry. Ji-Woo looked at the blueprints and asked questions. Lots of questions. What is pressure? Why does steam push the piston? Why can the boiler explode? Daniel explained. For hours. Ji-Woo listened and nodded. She didn't understand everything right away, but she understood the main point. Water turns into steam. Steam takes up more space. If the steam has nowhere to go, it breaks whatever is holding it back. So you have to give it a way out, a controlled one, through a valve into the cylinder. Piston down, exhaust. Piston up, steam again. Down again, and so on, endlessly, as long as the fire burns. She understood it in 3 evenings. Daniel thought that in his world, she would have become an engineer after 4 years at university. Here, she had no university, but she had hands that understood metal and a mind that understood power. They began building the boiler in the middle of the 10th month. Master Sun cast the sections of the body. Ji-woo welded them together. The term welded was a loose one. They heated the edges of the sections until they were white hot and hammered the joints together. Blacksmith welding, an ancient method, the only one available. Daniel checked every seam. He poured water over them and looked for leaks. The first hull leaked in 3 places. They redid the seams. The second hull leaked in 1. They redid it. The third didn't leak. They installed the smoke tubes. They put in the slide valve. They connected the cylinder and the piston, the connecting rod and the crank. A flywheel for smooth operation. They assembled it for 3 weeks. Daniel barely slept. Ha-eun brought him food right to the workshop. He ate without looking at his plate. She cleared the plate and set a new one. Once, she lingered. She stood there looking at the boiler blueprint spread out on the workbench. Daniel was drawing and didn't notice her. She wasn't looking at the blueprint. She was looking at his hand holding the pencil, at his soot-smeared fingers, at the lines they were drawing. Then she left quietly. Daniel didn't notice. The boiler was ready by the end of the 10th month. The first test was scheduled for the morning. Daniel forbade anyone come within 50 paces except himself and Ji-woo. Elise argued. Daniel said the boiler might explode. Elise asked why he was standing so close then. Daniel replied that it was because he knew when to run. It was a lie. He didn't know. But he knew that if the boiler exploded, there had to be someone nearby who understand why. They lit the fire. The water in the boiler began to heat up. Daniel monitored the pressure. He didn't have a pressure gauge. He made a simple indicator, a tube filled with water connected to the boiler. As the pressure rose, the water in the tube rose. He marked the tube with notches. Each notch represented a specific pressure. Rough, but sufficient. The water in the tube crept upward, the first mark, the second, the third. The boiler hummed. The walls were hot. Daniel placed his palm on the casing and pulled it away. Hot, but not too hot. The 4th mark, the 5th, the calculated operating pressure. Daniel opened the valve. Steam surged into the cylinder. The piston moved. The connecting rod turned the crankshaft. The flywheel turned a quarter turn and stopped. Daniel closed the valve. He inspected the mechanism. The piston was stuck. The cylinder packing was too tight. The steam couldn't push the piston all the way through its stroke. He loosened the packing. He tried again. The piston moved. The connecting rod turned the crankshaft. The flywheel made a full revolution, and another, and another. The machine was working. Daniel stood and watched as the wheel turned, slowly, with a tremor, with the hiss of steam escaping from the leaks, but it was turning. A steam engine, the first in the world. Ji-woo stood nearby. She wasn't smiling. She looked at the engine with the same expression other people use when watching the sunrise. Master Sun stood 50 paces away and crossed himself with the sign of the old wheel. But he didn't leave. Elise was writing something down in a notebook. Markham stood with his mouth agape. Daniel let the engine run for 10 minutes. Then he closed the valve and extinguished the fire. He inspected the boiler. The seams held. There were no leaks. The pressure was stable. He turned to the crew and said that this was only the beginning. The engine was running on a stationary base. To put it on wheels, they still had to make 100 things. A frame, drive wheels, a transmission from the piston to the wheels, a tender for water and coal, a smokestack with a spark arrestor, brakes, springs. He listed them off and saw the faces around him grow tense. 100 things, each of which had to be done right, each of which could kill if done wrong. He said it would take 3 months. Markham asked why. Horse-drawn traction works. The line brings in money. Why take the risk? Daniel answered with one word. Winter. Markham fell silent. He understood. In winter, snow blocks the road. In winter, horses slip on icy rails. In winter, the wagons don't run at all. And people go hungry precisely in winter. A steam locomotive doesn't slip. A steam locomotive is heavy. A steam locomotive runs on rails and doesn't care what's outside. Rain, snow, frost. It needs only fire and water. Markham nodded. Construction. 3 months. The end of the first year. Daniel was building the locomotive and simultaneously managing the line, which was getting busier and busier. Elise hired a ticket clerk at Brashier Station, and a ticket clerk at Colden Station, and trackmen, and watchmen. The little railroad was turning into a business with 30 employees. Daniel realized he needed someone to run the line while he built the locomotive. He needed a station master, a man who understood what a schedule was, what a timetable was, what order was. He found that person in the Port Tavern in Colden. Maddie O'Brien was sitting at a corner table, drinking. The area around her was empty. The stools had been pushed away. People were sitting at a distance. She was a large, red-haired woman of 31, with an anchor tattoo on her forearm and eyes that stared into her glass as if into a grave. Daniel sat down across from her. She looked up and asked what he wanted. He said he was looking for a former river barge captain. She said there were no former captains. There were only dead captains, and she would soon be one of them. Daniel asked what had happened to her barge. Maddie was silent for a long time. Then she said, "A storm. At a river rapids 3 days upstream. The barge capsized. 4 of the crew drowned. She swam to safety. She didn't know why she'd swum to safety. She hadn't wanted to." Daniel was silent. He didn't say he understood. He didn't say everything would be all right. He said he needed a station manager for the Colden station. A man who would draw up a schedule and make it work. A man who knew what order on the water was like and could bring order on land. Maddie looked at him. He said he'd pay 3 silver coins a week, a room above the station, and a job that wouldn't make you want to drink. Maddie finished her glass. She set it upside down on the table and said she'd start tomorrow. She started the next day, and within a week, the Colden station went from chaos to a well-oiled machine. Maddie commanded the stevedores with the same volume she'd used to command sailors. The carts left on schedule, cargo was weighed, documents were filled out. She hadn't had a drink since the day she turned the glass upside down. Daniel didn't ask about it. He could see she was struggling. He saw her clench the edge of the table with pale fingers as a barge floated past the station on the river. He saw her standing alone on the platform at night, staring at water. But she worked, and the station worked. That was enough, for now. The Brashier Colden line began turning a profit and lowered the price of bread in the city by 1/3. Daniel built the first steam engine, which ran successfully in stationary tests. Maddie O'Brien, a former barge captain, became the station master at Colden and got things in order within a week. They built the locomotive all winter. Daniel named it the Iron, and the name stuck. A frame of oak beams sheathed in iron, 4 driving wheels, a boiler mounted horizontally, cylinders on the sides. The tender for water and coal was on a separate platform at the rear. The construction was crude. Daniel knew it. In his world, people would have laughed at it. But in this world, there were no machine tools, no precision casting, and no rolling mills for sheet steel. Every part was made by hand. Master Sun forged every bolt. Jiwoo riveted every sheet of plating. Daniel designed and inspected. He inspected everything, every seam in the boiler, every rivet, every gap in the valve. Because a mistake in a steam boiler isn't an overturned cart with a stone. It's an explosion. It's boiling water and chunks of iron flying in all directions. It's death. The first pressure test took place at the beginning of winter. They lit a fire in the furnace. The pressure began to rise. Daniel stood nearby and watched the gauge. Water crept up the gauge. 3rd mark, 4th, 5th, working pressure, 6th, 7th. Daniel frowned. The pressure was rising too fast. He shouted at G to step back. And at that moment, the seam on the back wall of the boiler burst. Not an explosion, a rupture. A jet of steam shot sideways with a whistle that made his ears ring. Daniel instinctively shielded himself with his hand. The steam burned his forearm and palm. He jumped back, fell, rolled across the ground. Jiwoo was there a second later. She grabbed his uninjured arm and dragged him away. Master Sun flooded the furnace with water. Steam poured from the torn seam like from a wound. Daniel sat on the ground and looked at his hand. The skin was red. Blisters were already swelling. The pain came 3 seconds later. Sharp, burning. He clenched his teeth. Ha-In brought water and a cloth. She wrapped his arm in silence. Her fingers were trembling. Elise ran out of the office. She saw his arm. She turned pale. She opened her mouth. Daniel said it was a burn, not life-threatening. It would heal. Elise closed her mouth. She pressed her lips together and went to get the doctor. The doctor treated the burn with herbal ointment. He said the arm would heal in 3 weeks. Scars would remain. Daniel nodded. Scars? Fine. He'd already been thinking about the seam, why it had burst. He knew why. Forge welding isn't reliable on curved surfaces. The seam on the back wall ran along the radius. The stresses were distributed unevenly. Under high pressure, the weak spot tears first. He needed a different joining technology, or a different boiler shape, or both. He thought about it for 2 weeks. He drew with his left hand because his right was in bandages. The drawings came out crooked. Jiwoo stood nearby and translated his scribbles into clean drawings. She had learned to read his lines, even the crooked ones. The solution came in the 3rd week. Not a different welding method, a different boiler. Instead of 1 large cylinder, 2 small ones, each half the diameter. A smaller diameter means less stress on the walls at the same pressure. This allowed for thinner metal and simpler welds. The 2 boilers operated in parallel, feeding steam into a single cylinder. The design was more complex, but safer. And he added a safety valve, a simple one, a spring-loaded plug that opens when the pressure exceeds the limit and releases steam outside. Safe, controlled. He should have installed the valve from the very beginning. He didn't. He was in a hurry. Again. He looked at the piece of paper pinned to the wall. Don't rush. People are more important than the schedule. And he added, and you're a person too. They built the 2nd boiler more carefully. Daniel checked every seam 3 times, filled it with pressurized water, held it for an hour. 2. 3. Looking for the slightest leak. Jiwoo helped. She became a different person after that day. Quieter, more serious. She checked the seams with such meticulousness that Master Sun grumbled that she was wasting time. Jiwoo looked at her father and said that time was cheaper than life. Master Sun fell silent. The 2nd boiler was ready by midwinter. The test went off without a hitch. The pressure rose smoothly, the safety valve activated at the calculated pressure. It released a jet of steam and closed. The boiler held. The seams held. Everything worked. They mounted the boiler on the frame, connected the cylinders, the connecting rods, the drive wheels, the tender with water and coal, the smokestack. They put the iron on the rails on the last day of winter. It stood on the tracks at Brasher Station and looked ridiculous. Clumsy, heavy, with 2 pipes instead of 1 because it had 2 boilers. Riveted plating, rough wheels, no grace, no beauty, pure function. Daniel stood in front of it and thought that no locomotive in the history of his world had looked worse. And none had meant more. The first run was scheduled for the morning. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He sat in the iron's cab and fiddled with the levers. The steam regulator, reverse, brake, whistle. He'd made the whistle from a brass tube. Rough, hoarse, but loud. The morning was cold. Snow lay on the tracks. The frost bit his fingers. A crowd had gathered at the station. 100 people, maybe more. Rumors of an iron carriage that ran without horses had spread throughout the city over the course of a week. Daniel stood in the cab. Jiwoo was beside him. She volunteered to be the stoker, to shovel coal into the firebox. Daniel didn't object. Her hands were more reliable than anyone else's. He lit the fire in the firebox. The coal caught fire. Smoke began to rise from the chimney. The water in the boilers started to heat up. The pressure crept upward. Daniel waited. The people in the crowd were whispering. Someone was laughing. Someone was making the sign of the wheel. The pressure reached the operating level. Daniel placed his hand on the valve. He looked at Ji-woo. She nodded. He opened the valve. Steam surged into the cylinders. The pistons moved. The connecting rods turned the drive wheels, and the iron began to move. Slowly, with a clang, with a rumble. Steam hissed from every leak. It crawled along the tracks like a sick animal, but it crawled, without a horse, without an ox, on its own. The crowd fell silent. Daniel blew his whistle. A hoarse roar echoed over the station. The iron took on speed, slowly. The tracks hummed. The snow melted under the hot wheels. Smoke from the pipes trailed behind the cab like a black tail. They covered the first mile in 12 minutes. Not fast. A horse could do it in 8. But the iron took 3 freight cars in tow, 1.5 tons. A single horse wouldn't have budged it. They reached Colden in an hour and a half, slower than Daniel had expected. Steam losses due to leaks were greater than he'd thought. The valve was working in fits and starts. One of the drive wheels had a slight wobble. Daniel saw all the flaws. He was noting them down in his head, a long list. But the iron reached its destination. It reached to Colden and stopped at the station. Maddie was standing on the platform. She was looking at the locomotive, at the smoke from the stacks, at J.U.'s face, red from the heat in the cab, at Daniel, who was standing with his hand on the throttle, smiling. Maddie said one sentence. "Damn, he's the real deal." Daniel laughed, for the first time in months. The iron was real, crooked, slow, unreliable, but real. Aaron's first steam locomotive stood on the tracks at Colden Station, puffing steam into the winter sky. And Daniel knew that after this day, nothing would ever be the same again. The first steam boiler exploded during testing, and Daniel suffered a burn on his hand. He redesigned the boiler, making it out of 2 small cylinders with a safety valve. The Utyug locomotive made its first trip from Brashear to Colden in the winter of the first year. A week passed after the Utyug's first trip. Daniel spent it on repairs. He sealed the valve. He tightened the connecting rods. He replaced the cylinder liners. The iron became a little better with each passing day, a little faster, a little more reliable, but it remained the same clumsy, loud monster that scared horses from half a mile away. News of the locomotive spread faster than the locomotive itself traveled. Merchants from neighboring towns sent people to see it. Some came themselves. They stood at the station and watched as the ironing board puffing away toward Colden. They touched the rails. They shook their heads. They left, deep in thought. Mayor Aldrich came in person. He stood on the platform. He watched. Then he told Daniel that the city council wanted to discuss the expansion, where the tracks would go next. Daniel said that beyond Colden they would head north, to Tainholm, the capital of one of the 4 northern kingdoms, 60 miles, over a mountain pass. Aldrich raised his eyebrows. A mountain pass? Daniel nodded. He knew it was madness. But Tainholm was the key to the entire north. If Brayshire were connected to Tainholm, grain from the south could travel north all winter long, without interruption, without the slush, without checkpoints and tolls at every crossroads. Aldrich said that would require permission from the king of Tainholm, and it would cost 10 times more than the line to Colden. Daniel said he knew. It was at that very moment that Princess Yeren entered his life. She arrived in Brayshire without warning, a carriage bearing the royal coat of arms of Tainholm, 4 mounted guards, 1 lady-in-waiting who looked as if she'd rather be anywhere but Brayshire. Yeren was 17, petite, dark hair, lively eyes that looked at everything around her as if seeing the world for the first time. She jumped out of the carriage without waiting for the steps. The lady-in-waiting gasped. The guards exchanged glances. Yeren was already walking toward the station. She was carrying a leather journal and a letter from her father. The letter stated that Princess Yeren, the youngest daughter of King Tainholm, was traveling to Brashear to study modern sciences. The king requested that she be assisted and kept safe. Between the lines, something else was clear. Her father had sent her far away from the court, far away from her older brothers, the heirs, who were fighting over the throne like dogs over a bone. An honorable exile. Daniel read the letter. He looked at Yeren. She was already standing by the iron and touching the wheel. He said he'd be happy to help, and he regretted it that very same day. Yeren asked questions, constantly, without pause. What kind of metal is this? Why do the rails shine? Why do the ties are wooden and not stone? Why the steam is hot, what pressure is, what a valve is, why there's a protrusion on the wheel, why the pipe is on top and not on the side, how much the locomotive weighs, how much a mile of track costs. Daniel answered, at first patiently, then wearily, then irritably. Yedin didn't notice the irritation. Or perhaps she did notice, but paid no attention. She wrote down every answer in her diary, in neat handwriting, with drawings in the margins. After 3 days, Daniel realized 2 things. First, Yedin wasn't stupid. Her questions were precise. She didn't ask pointlessly. She was piecing together a picture. Each question was a brick in the wall of understanding she was building methodically and patiently. Second, she was lonely. Her lady-in-waiting ignored her. The guards stood aloof. No one in the palace spoke to her as a human being. She was considered cute and useless, an ornament that had been shelved. Daniel decided to give her a task, a real one, not a training exercise. He summoned her to his office and told her he needed help. The Brasher-Colden line was operational. The carts ran every day, but the schedule was haphazard. There was no system, no calculation. He wanted Yedin to draw up a schedule for the winter. How many trips a day, what time they'd depart, how many minutes for loading, how many for unloading, where the carts split up if the line is single track. Yedin listened. Her eyes grew serious. She asked where the data was. Daniel showed her Elise's books, Maddie's notes, Ha-Un's map. He said she had a week. Yedin left with the books under her arm. 3 days later she returned. Not a week later. 3 days later. She placed the schedule on the table. Daniel looked at it. 4 trips a day, 2 in each direction. Departure from Brasher at 7 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. Departure from Colden at 10 in the morning and 5 in the evening. A layover at the 9th mile where there was a small clearing. 20 minutes for loading, 15 for unloading. 30 minutes of buffer time for unforeseen delays at the end of the day. Everything had been calculated. Everything added up. Daniel checked it for half an hour. He found one mistake, a minor one. The turnaround time had been calculated for horse-drawn transport. The iron went faster. It needed to be adjusted. He pointed out the mistake to her. Yedin blushed. Then she grabbed a quill and corrected it. In a minute, without extra calculations, in her head. Daniel looked at her and said the schedule was excellent. Yedin didn't answer. She stood there, clutching the quill so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Elise watched from the corner. She could see Yedin's face. The kind of face a person makes when, for the first time in their life, they're told they've done something well. Meanwhile, winter was gaining strength. Snow covered the tracks every night. The steamroller moved more slowly. Workers cleared the path with shovels every morning. The cold cracked the ties. Moisture froze in the cracks and split the wood. Daniel replaced the ties and thought about the preservative, about the creosote that wasn't available here, about the substitute he needed to find. But Winter's main problem wasn't the ties. It was the village of Holdfast. Holdfast stood in the mountains 20 miles north of Colden, a mountain village, 300 people. In winter, the pass was buried in snow, and the village found itself cut off from the world. Usually, the residents stocked up on grain in the fall and made it through until spring. This year, the fall had been rainy. The harvest was ruined. There wasn't enough grain. By midwinter, the grain was running out in Holdfast. Maddie was the first to find out. A man from Holdfast came to see her in Colden, exhausted, frostbitten. He'd been walking across the pass for 2 days. He said the village had a week left, maybe less. The children were already starving. Maddie came to Daniel that night. He saw her face and knew something terrible had happened. She told him. Daniel asked why Holdfast mattered to her. Maddie was silent. Then she said she'd grown up there, that her mother still lived there, that she hadn't been home in 4 years, ever since her team drowned. Daniel looked at her. She wasn't crying. She stood straight and spoke calmly, but her hands were shaking. He asked if there was a road from Colden to Holdfast. Maddie said there was a trail, over a mountain pass. In the summer, mules travel along it. In the winter, it's impassable. Snow up to your waist. The wind knocks you off your feet. A wagon train couldn't make it. Daniel asked about the rails. Maddie looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. 20 miles of mountain trail, in winter, snow, a steep incline. It's impossible. Daniel said he didn't need rails. He needed a trail. And the iron. He'd been thinking all night. By morning, he had a plan. A crazy one, but the only one. He couldn't lay tracks to hold fast in a week, but he could lay part of them. 10 miles from Colden, down the valley to the foot of the pass. Flat ground, minimal incline. If 50 men worked non-stop, they could lay a temporary track in 4 days. Not a permanent one, no embankment. Rails laid directly on the frozen ground, sleepers made from whatever they could find. It would hold for 1 trip, maybe 2. Then it'll fall apart. But he needs just 1 trip. The iron won't make it the last 10 miles from the foot of the pass to hold fast. There are no rails there, and there won't be any. But at the foot of the pass, they can transfer the grain to sleds and haul the sleds up through the snow. With oxen, with people, whatever it takes. 10 miles instead of 20. It's doable. He gathered the team in the morning, explained the plan. Jiwoo said that temporary rails without a ballast bed wouldn't hold the iron's weight. Daniel said they would if they went slowly, no more than 5 miles an hour. The frozen ground is hard as rock. If it doesn't thaw, it'll hold. Ha-eun unfolded the map. She had already mapped out the route. 10 miles through the valley, 2 turns, 1 climb with a 140 gradient. Daniel looked at the climb and said the iron would make it. Probably. Maddie said she'd go as a stoker. Elise said she'd organize people to lay the track. Markham gave the money without asking questions. Lady Sage sent 20 workers from her estate. They started that very day. 50 men laid the rails on the frozen ground. No embankment. Sleepers made of rough-hewn logs. The rails were those very straight strips from GU's foundry shed. The spikes went into the frozen wood with difficulty. The workers' hands bled from the cold. Daniel worked alongside everyone else. He drove in the spikes. He hauled sleepers. His burned right hand ached in the cold. He paid no attention. 4 days. They laid 10 miles in 4 days. The track was terrible, crooked, uneven. The rails lay on frozen logs that lay on frozen ground. Any inspector in Daniel's world would have shut down this line in a minute. But it was there, and the iron would run on it, had to run on it. Princess Yeren had arrived from Tainholm and drawn up the line's first real schedule. The mountain village of Holdfast was on the brink of starvation that winter. In 4 days, Daniel and the crew had laid 10 miles of temporary track from Colden to the foot of the pass to deliver grain. The night before the trip to Holdfast, Daniel stood in the depot and looked at the iron. The locomotive stood on the tracks, cold and dark. Tomorrow morning, it would have to haul 4 grain cars along the temporary track, 10 miles across frozen ground. Then, the grain would be transferred to sleds, and the sleds would go up through the pass, another 10 miles, to Holdfast. Daniel checked the boilers, checked the valves, checked the connecting rods, checked the safety valves, checked the wheels, checked the brakes, checked everything he could check. Then, he checked again. GU came to the depot at midnight. She brought her tools and silently began checking the rivets on the boiler shell. Daniel didn't ask why she had come. He knew. She was afraid. Not for herself, for the locomotive, for the cause. They worked side by side in silence until 3 in the morning. Then Ji-woo sat down on the rail and said her father thought this was madness. Daniel said her father was right. Ji-woo said she thought it was madness too. But madness that could save 300 people was better than common sense that would bury them. Daniel looked at her. She was 20. In his world, she would be taking exams at the university. Here, she was the foundry foreman and was about to drive a locomotive through the night on temporary tracks laid on frozen ground. He said she would be the engineer, not him. She knows the iron better than he does. She assembled every part of it with her own hands. Ji-woo looked at him. Then she nodded, without a word. Morning, 20 below, wind from the mountains, darkness. Dawn had not yet broken. Torches were burning at the Colden station. Maddie stood on the platform and directed the loading. 4 cars, grain in sacks. 2 cars from Markham, One from the Brasher merchants who had chipped in after Elise had outmaneuvered them all in a single night. One from Lady Sage. Holdfast was written in chalk on every sack. Maddie had written it herself, on every one. Daniel stoked the fire in the furnace. The coal caught fire. Smoke poured from the stacks and drifted into the frost in white plumes. The pressure began to rise. GU stood in the cab, hands on the control. Her face was calm. Maddie climbed into the cab. She was the stoker, a shovel in her hands. Daniel stood beside her. He was shoveling coal too. 3 people in the cab: the engineer, the stoker, the fireman. The pressure reached the operating level. GU blew the whistle. A hoarse roar shattered the morning silence, and the iron went on its way, along the temporary tracks, across the frozen ground, in the darkness, by the light of torches that the workers had placed along the track every 100 paces, a fiery trail stretching into the night. The iron moved slowly, 3 miles an hour. The rails creaked, the ties sagged. Daniel listened to every sound, a creak, a knock, a screech. He knew which sounds were normal and which weren't. So far, everything was normal. So far. The 5th mile. Dawn began to break. A gray streak in the east. The wind picked up. Snow was blowing horizontally. Maddie shoveled coal rhythmically, without pause. The shovel went into the tender and came out with coal, time and again. Her face was red from the heat and white from the cold at the same time. 8th mile. The climb began. 1/40th. According to Daniel's textbooks, this was the maximum gradient for a loaded locomotive. The iron didn't read textbooks. It slowed down. The wheels began to slip on the icy rails. GU added a couple of pounds of steam. The pressure jumped. The iron growled and crawled upward, slowly. Every turn of the wheels was a struggle. Daniel watched the pressure gauge, the 6th mark, the 7th. The working pressure was at the 5th. They were going higher. The safety valve should activate at the 8th mark. Jiwoo knew it. She kept the pressure between the 7th and 8th marks, precisely, confidently, as if she'd been doing this her whole life. The 9th mile. The climb continued. The wheels were spinning. Maddie dropped the shovel. She grabbed the bucket of sand that Daniel had thought to bring. She leaned out of the cab and poured sand onto the tracks in front of the drive wheels. The sand provided traction. The wheels stopped spinning. For a second. Then again. Maddie poured more and more. The 10th mile, the end of the temporary track, the foot of the pass. The iron stopped with a hiss and a clang. Jiwoo closed the throttle. The pressure began to drop. They stood there. All around was snow, mountains, wind, and the silence that settles in when a steam engine falls silent. At the foot of the pass, people were waiting for them. 20 people from the surrounding villages with sleds and oxen. Maddie had organized them the day before. She had sent messengers, promised payment, promised a share of the grain. They came. The transfer took an hour. Sacks of grain onto the sleds, oxen harnessed, people nearby, 10 sleds, 20 people, 10 miles up through the pass. Maddie took the lead of the caravan. She knew the trail. She grew up on this trail. Daniel wanted to go with them. Maddie said no. She said he had no business at the pass. His business was the tracks. Her business was the delivery. She turned and walked away. The caravan moved after her, slowly, heavily, up the white slope. Daniel stood by the iron and watched them leave. Tiny figures on the white snow, smaller and smaller. Then they disappeared around the bend. He waited, all day, all night. The iron stood with its firebox cold. Jiwoo slept in the cab, wrapped in a greatcoat. Daniel sat on the step and didn't sleep. Ha-eun came from Kolden on foot. She brought food, a thermos of hot tea she'd brewed herself. Daniel took the thermos and thanked her. She sat down beside him, silently. They sat and waited. At dawn on the second day, the caravan returned. Maddie was walking in front. Her face was frostbitten. Her hands were covered in bleeding cracks. The sleds were empty. The grain was in holdfast. She walked up to Daniel and said they had made it. All the sacks were there. 300 people would have food until spring. Then she said one more thing. She said her mother had come out to meet the caravan on the outskirts. An old woman in a woolen shawl. She saw Maddie and stopped. Maddie stopped too. They stood facing each other in the snow. 4 years of silence. 4 years of shame and guilt and vodka. Then her mother walked over and hugged her. And Maddie hugged her mother. And they stood like that for so long until the snow covered their shoulders. Maddie told this and fell silent. Daniel said nothing. Words were unnecessary. They climbed into the iron's cab. Jiu stoked the fire. Maddie took a shovel. Daniel stood at the controls. And they drove back to Colden, along the temporary tracks, across the frozen ground, slowly and steadily. When they returned to Colden Station, a crowd, workers, merchants, residents, someone had found out where the iron had gone that night, and why. The iron came to a stop. Steam was coming from the chimney. The hole was hot. Jiu shut down the engine. An old woman stepped out of the crowd, a small, stooped woman. She wasn't from Holdfast. She was from Colden, but she had heard. She approached the locomotive, slowly. She placed her palm on the hot side of the iron and said quietly, "Thank you, iron." The crowd was silent. Maddie stood in the cab and looked down. Her face was wet, not from the snow. Daniel stood next to her and felt something tighten in his chest. Not pride, not joy, something more. Understanding. That he was where he belonged. That this world, no matter how foreign it was, had become his home. Because there were people here who needed what he could do, and he was doing it. Not for glory, not for money, for the old woman who placed her palm on the hot side of the locomotive and said, "Thank you." For Maddie's mother on the snow-covered outskirts, for Lady Sage's children who laugh at the little locomotive, for Ji-woo who found herself at the anvil, for Ha-eun who draws correctly, for Elise who was finally being heard. He didn't build infrastructure, he mended people's lives, just with iron. Daniel stepped off the locomotive. He stood on the platform. Snow fell on his shoulders. The frost stung his cheeks. He looked at the tracks leading south toward Brasher, and north toward Tainholm, toward the Four Kingdoms, toward the entire continent, which was suffocating under its own slowness. He needed to keep building. Spring came, and the snow began to melt. The temporary tracks leading to the foot of the pass floated away with it. The frozen ground softened. The ties sank into the mud. The rails buckled. Within a week, nothing usable remained of the 10 miles of temporary track. Daniel stood on the outskirts of Colden and looked at the ruins of his winter road. He wasn't upset. He knew it would be this way. The temporary track had served its purpose. Holdfast had survived. 300 men had made it to spring. It had cost 10 miles of rails that now lay in the mud as twisted iron scrap. A fair price. Now it was time to build for real. Not a temporary track on frozen ground. A real line. With an embankment, with ballast, with bridges. From Colden through the mountains to Tainholm. 60 miles, over the pass, across rivers, through the lands of 3 different lords, each of whom wanted his share. Daniel returned to Brasher and sat down to do the calculations. Ha-in spread her maps out on the office floor. She hadn't been idle over the winter. She had walked the entire route from Colden to Tainholm on foot, twice. Once in the fall before the snows, once in early spring when the snow still lay but the trails had already opened. 2 maps, fall and spring. Different water levels in the rivers, different contours of the slopes. Daniel looked at the maps and saw the route. Not just one, 3 options. The northern bypass through Clearwater Valley. Long, 70 miles, but gentle. Maximum gradient, 1/60th. The direct route through Grey Rock Pass. Short, 45 miles, but a 1/20th gradient on the pass section. The steam locomotive won't make it. We need a new locomotive, a more powerful one, or a tunnel. The southern route through Bear River Gorge, 55 miles, moderate gradient, but 4 bridges over a river that turns into a raging torrent in the spring. Daniel chose the northern route. Elise calculated the cost. The figure was enormous, 10 times more than the line to Colden. Markham couldn't handle it. Lady Sage couldn't handle it. All the merchants of Brayshire combined couldn't handle it. A different scale was needed. A king was needed. It was then that Yeren said she would go to her father. Daniel looked at her. She stood in the office with a journal in her hands. In 3 months in Brayshire, she had filled the journal to the last page. Calculations, diagrams, schedules, notes from conversations with Daniel, with Elise, with Maddie, with Ha-un. She said she would go to Tainholm and show her father what Long Road can do for the kingdom. Not Daniel will show him, she will. Because Daniel is a stranger from nowhere, and she is the king's daughter. And because she can explain what Daniel cannot. Not the technical stuff, the politics. Daniel wanted to object. Elise put her hand on his shoulder and shook her head. She's right, let her go. Yeren left 2 days later. She took 3 things with her: a diary, a map of Ha-in with the northern route marked on it, and Elise's calculations showing that the line would pay for itself in 4 years. Daniel stood at the gate and watched her carriage drive away. Yeren leaned out the window and waved. He raised his hand, and thought that 3 months ago she had been a child banished far from the court, and now she was going to defend a project worth the kingdom's annual budget. Before her father, before the courtiers, before the brothers who despised her. He didn't know if she would succeed, but he knew she would try. While Yeren was in Tainholm, Daniel wasn't sitting idle. He was building a school. Not a building. The building was an old warehouse by the port that Markham had given over for classrooms. Daniel was building a program. 12 students, young lads from Brayshire and the surrounding villages. Some were brought by their parents. Some came on their own. One came from Holdfast, a 17-year-old boy named Tobin. He said he'd seen a steam locomotive bring in grain that winter, and he wanted to build things like that. Daniel taught them arithmetic, geometry, drafting, the basics of mechanics, properties of materials. He drew on the blackboard with chalk and explained things that, in his world, were taught in the first semester of engineering school. Here, it was a revelation. The students looked at him as if he were a prophet. He told them he wasn't a prophet. He was an engineer. And they, too, would be engineers. In a year. In 2. If they worked hard. Jiwoo led the practical sessions. She showed them how to work with metal, how to read a blueprint, how to use a rolling mill. The students feared her more than they did Daniel. She was strict, uncompromising. If a student set a rivet crooked, she would silently point to the furnace. Do it over. No explanations, no exceptions. Master Sun helped, silently. He stood behind the students and watched them work. Sometimes he'd place a heavy hand on a shoulder and adjust the grip on the hammer. Not with words, with his hands, just as he had been taught, just as he would have taught a son if he had had one. His daughter stood by the rolling mill and commanded the foundry, and he accepted it. Not right away, not easily, but he accepted it. Meanwhile, Elise was conducting negotiations, with merchants, with lords, with representatives of neighboring kingdoms. She traveled to Colden, to West Hill, to the 3 cities on the coast. Everywhere she said the same thing. A railroad is not the miracle of a single man. It is an investment. Here are the figures. Here is the payback calculation. Here is the cost per mile. Here is the profit from the first line. She spoke calmly, without emotion, with figures. The merchants listened. Some nodded. Some shook their heads. But they all took it in. Ha-in went out into the field. She marked out the northern route, alone, with a compass, a measuring rope, and 5 pencils. Daniel suggested sending assistants with her. She said the assistants would get in the way. She would leave for a week. She would return with a new section of the map. She would leave again. Once she returned with a cut on her cheek and a torn sleeve. Daniel asked what had happened. She said she'd run into bandits. Daniel turned pale. She said she'd run away. She's a good runner. Daniel said he wouldn't let her go alone anymore. Ha-un looked at him over her glasses, calmly, and said he couldn't stop her. She wasn't his employee. She was his partner. And she decided for herself where she went and when. Daniel opened his mouth. then closed it. She was right. He said okay. But she should at least take a knife. Ha-eun said she had a knife. She'd had it since day one. She just didn't like to show it off. She adjusted her glasses and walked away to unfold the map. Daniel stood there watching her go. Elise came up behind him and said he had a very silly look on his face. Daniel said he knew. Yedin returned 3 weeks later with a letter from the king. The king of Tainholm agreed, not to everything, to the first phase. 30 miles from Kolden to an intermediate station halfway to Tainholm. The crown would pay half. Investors would cover the other half. If the first phase successful, the crown would pay the rest. Daniel read the letter and looked at Yedin. She stood tall, not like a child, like someone who had done what no one expected of her. He asked how she'd managed it. Yedin said she'd addressed the council, with Elise's figures, with Ha-eun's map, with her own schedule. She spoke for 2 hours. Her brothers tried to interrupt her. Her father remained silent. When she finished, her father stood up and said he would provide the funds. Not because he believed in the railroad, because for the first time in his life, his daughter had spoken like an heiress. Yedin said this and fell silent. Her eyes were shining, but she didn't cry. She was no longer the child who had arrived in Brayshire 6 months ago. Daniel chose the northern route to Tainholm and opened an engineering school with 12 students. Yedin went to her father, the king, and convinced him to invest in the first phase of construction. Ha-eun continued surveying the route on her own, while Elise negotiated with investors along the entire coast. Construction of the line to the north began at the start of the second year. The scale was different. Not 50 workers, 200. Not a single rolling mill, 3. Not just one iron. Daniel was designing the second locomotive. More powerful, heavier, with an improved boiler and a new valve system that Ji-woo had suggested herself. She had sketched the design on a scrap of tin with a nail, roughly, but the idea was sound. A double valve with an overlap. Steam was used more efficiently. Power increased while coal consumption remained the same. Daniel looked at the sketch and thought that in 2 years, Ji-woo would be able to design steam locomotives without him. This thought pleased him. It didn't scare him. It pleased him. Because that was exactly what he was building. Not a road, a system that works without him. The second locomotive was named the Hammer, at the suggestion of Master Sun, who, for the first time in 2 years, had suggested something out loud. Everyone was surprised. He paid no attention. The work continued. The tracks stretched north from Kolden through the Clearwater Valley. Embankment, sleepers, ballast made of river gravel, bridges over streams, culverts, passing loops every 10 miles. Daniel worked 16 hours a day. Elise made him eat. He would forget. She would bring a plate and set it on the blueprints. He would eat without looking. She would clear the plate. It became a... Once he looked up from the blueprints and saw that Elise was sitting across from him, looking at him. Not at the blueprints. At him. He asked what was wrong. She said nothing, just looking. He nodded and went back to the blueprints. Elise sighed quietly. Ha-eun would have noticed that sigh. Ji-woo would have noticed. Daniel didn't notice. He saw the tracks and the embankments and the bridges. He was worse at seeing people. That was his weakness. He knew it. But there was nothing he could do about it. Meanwhile, the world around him was changing. The Brayshire-Kolden line had been in operation for 9 months. Freight traffic had quadrupled. Freight rates had fallen 6-fold. Warehouses were springing up around the stations, shops, inns for those waiting for their cargo to be loaded. A small town had sprung up at the junction at the 9-mile mark. People called it the 9, just the 9. Eliza suggested building a station there. Daniel built it. 3 platforms, a rain shelter, a ticket office. The 9 doubled in size in a month. Maddie managed the entire line from Kolden. She hired 4 station attendants, 2 ticket clerks, 6 porters, 10 track workers for repairs. The little railroad became a business with 80 employees. Maddie hadn't had a drink in days, but Daniel could see she was struggling. He saw her standing alone on the platform at night, clutching the railing with pale fingers. He walked up to her once and asked how she was. Maddie said she was fine. He said fine wasn't an answer. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said that every night she sees the faces of her drowned sailors. 4 faces. She remembers every one, every name, every voice. She said that work helps. During the day, she doesn't think about them. At night, she does. Daniel was silent. Then he said that work is good, but not enough, and that if she ever feels really bad, she should come to him. Anytime, at night, in the morning, whenever. Maddie nodded. Then she said thank you, and she left. The next morning she worked as usual, loudly, harshly, yelling at the loaders for being late. But something in her posture had changed. She stood a little straighter. Construction in the north had reached the 20th mile when the news came. House Calder and House Vespri were pulling their troops up to the border. The war that had been smoldering for 3 years was about to flare up. The reason was an old one. The disputed province of Marchwood, fertile lands between the 2 kingdoms. Both houses considered Marchwood their own. Both maintained garrisons there. Both were waiting for a pretext. A pretext was found. The Vespers raised the toll on grain passing through Marchwood. The Calders declared this a violation of the old treaty. Envoys were recalled. Armies marched. Daniel listened to the news and did the math. The Calder army was coming from the north, 30,000 men. Marching speed, 12 miles a day, 120 miles to the border, 10 days' march. The Vespri army was coming from the south, 25,000, same speed, 100 miles, 8 days. Supplies for both armies were carried by supply trains, slow, heavy. The Calder supply train stretched along a road that ran 30 miles from Daniel's line. The Vespri supply train was moving further south. Daniel looked at the map and saw what no one else saw. Both armies would reach the border hungry, because the supply trains would fall behind, because supply trains always fall behind. An army marches faster than oxen pull carts. By the time battle began, both sides would have 3 days' worth of food, maybe 5. Then starvation, then retreat, then a new march the following spring, just as it had been for the past 3 years. A senseless war that could not end because neither army could feed itself long enough to win. Lady Sage arrived in Brasher a week before the march began. She was pale. Calm, but pale. She said her father, Lord Calder, had demanded that Daniel provide the railroad for transporting military supplies. Daniel's tracks ran from Brasher northward toward Calder territory, the perfect route for military cargo. If Daniel refused, the Calders would confiscate the tracks. If he agreed, the Vespers would declare him an enemy. Daniel sat in his office, staring at the map. Elise sat next to him. Ha-un stood by the wall. Jiwoo crossed her arms over her chest. Maddie sat in the corner. Yurin clutched her diary. Lady Sage stood by the window, waiting for an answer. Daniel was silent for a long time. He was thinking, not about politics, about logistics, about the schedule, about what he controlled. And by morning, he had a plan. Construction of the line to the north was in full swing with 200 workers and the second hammer locomotive. The war between House Calder and House Vespri had entered an active phase. Lord Calder demanded that the railroad be made available for military supplies, and Daniel found himself caught between 2 warring sides. The plan was simple. Daniel wouldn't give his railway to anyone, not the Calders, not the Vespers. Instead, he would stop the war, not with a sword, not with an army, with a schedule. He gathered his team that morning. He explained. Both armies depended on supplies. The supply trains traveled along the roads. The roads ran through the towns and villages that lined Daniel's route. The drivers for the supply trains were hired in those very towns. The horses were bought at those very markets. The grain for the army's bread came from those very warehouses, the very same warehouses that now operate through Daniel's stations. If Daniel stops traffic along the line, the warehouses will grind to a halt. If the warehouses grind to a halt, there will be no grain for the supply trains. If there is no grain, the supply trains won't leave. If the supply trains don't leave, the armies will come to a standstill in 5 days, hungry, without supplies, out in the open. Elise looked at him and said it was suicide. If he stopped the line, both sides would declare him an enemy. Both, at the same time. Daniel said that was exactly what he was counting on. Maddie said he was crazy. Daniel said maybe, but he had no other plan. Lady Sage was silent. Then she said that if he did this, her father would send people to burn down every station. Daniel said that was exactly what he wanted to talk about. He explained the second part of the plan. He wouldn't just stop the line. He would gather people at every station. Not soldiers, workers. Railroad workers, engineers, ticket clerks, wives, children. Everyone the railroad has given work and bread to over the past year. And he would tell both sides one thing. If you want to fight, fight. But there will be no supplies. Because the people who feed your armies are standing at my stations, and they won't leave, because the railroad is their life. Elise said it was blackmail. Daniel said it was a negotiating position. Ji-woo said that if soldiers came with weapons, nothing would stop the people. Daniel said that soldiers are people too. Their wives also buy bread at the stations. Their children also eat the grain that the iron brings. A soldier might burn down a station, but his family will go hungry tomorrow. Ha-eun unfolded a map. All 6 stations on the line were marked on it. Brashear, 9, Colden, and 3 new ones on the northern section. She said that if both armies were heading for the border, they would pass by the 3 northern stations, through territory that is completely dependent on rail deliveries. Stopping the line means stopping life in 3 towns. That's bad. Daniel said he knew it was bad, but war is worse. War will kill thousands. Shutting down the line won't kill anyone if it lasts no more than a week. Maddie said that if the line stops for a week, they might not restart it afterward. Merchants will lose confidence. Investors will flee. Everything they've built over 2 years will collapse in 7 days. Daniel said it's a risk, and that he's willing to take it, because if war breaks out, the line will be destroyed anyway. Both sides will tear it to pieces. They'll use the rails for spears, the ties for bonfires, the locomotives for scrap metal. War will destroy the road. Stopping it will preserve a chance. Lady Sage said she would go to her father. She would try to buy time. She didn't promise anything, but she'll try. Yedin said she'd write to her brothers. Her eldest brother commanded the northern garrison at Tainholm. If Tainholm intervenes as a mediator, it will change the balance of power. Daniel nodded. He turned to Ji-woo and said he needed iron. Tonight. For the whole night. Ji-woo nodded without asking any questions. Night. Daniel sat in the iron's cab. Ji-woo was beside him, at the controls. Maddie with a shovel. Ha-eun with a map and a lantern. They left Brashear at midnight. First stop, 9. Daniel got out at the station. He roused the night watchman from his bed. He explained. By morning, everyone working on the line had to be gathered. Track workers, freight handlers, ticket clerks, their families, everyone. They had to be at the station by dawn. The duty officer asked why. Daniel said there was a war going on and that the station was in danger, and that the only defense was the people who would stand up and say no. The duty officer ran off to wake people up. The iron went on. Colden, same procedure. Maddie went out and organized everything in 20 minutes. She pounded on doors. She shouted. She gave orders. People came out sleepy and scared. She spoke to them briefly. The road is in danger. Come to the station. Further north, 3 new stations. At each one, Daniel stepped out and said the same thing. War is coming. They want to take your road. If you want to keep it, come in the morning and stand. Just stand. People listened. Some nodded right away. Some asked, and what happens next? Daniel was telling the truth. He didn't know what would happen next, but if they didn't come, there would be nothing left. By dawn, the iron had returned to Brashear. Daniel hadn't slept all night. His eyes were burning. His hands trembled with exhaustion, but he couldn't stop. In the morning, he climbed onto the platform at Brashear Station. A crowd stood before him, 300 people, laborers, blacksmiths, porters, merchants who depended on the line, their wives, their children. They stood in silence and waited. Daniel spoke briefly. He said that two armies were marching toward each other, that both sides wanted his railway, that he wouldn't give it to anyone, that he was halting traffic on the entire line, starting now. Not a single train would leave, not a single wagon would move, until both sides sat down at the negotiating table. He said it hurt, that every day of the stoppage meant lost money and lost trust, but that war meant lost lives, and that he chooses money over lives. He said he was asking them for one thing, to stand at their stations, not to leave, not to hide, to stand and show both armies that the road isn't just rails and ties. The road is people, and people can't be burned like a wooden shed. The crowd was silent. Then someone shouted that he would stay, then another, then another. A minute later, everyone was shouting. Elise stood next to Daniel and took notes. She always took notes. The steam locomotive stood on the tracks with its firebox extinguished. The hammer stood in the depot. The tracks were empty. For the first time in 9 months, not a single train ran on the Brayshire Co. Not a single train was running. Silence. A strange, frightening silence. Daniel sat down on the edge of the platform and waited. War came 2 days later. Daniel decided to halt traffic along the entire line to cut off both armies' supplies and force them to negotiate. In a single night, he traveled to all 6 stations along the iron to gather people. At each station, hundreds of workers and residents who refused to leave gathered. Garrick Vaughan's men were the first to arrive. Not soldiers, cart drivers. 200 men with torches. They approached Station 9 at night. The guard on duty saw the lights and sounded the alarm. 400 people were at the station. Workers, their families, the residents of Station 9 who, over the past few months, had become one with the station. The drivers stopped 100 paces away. They looked at the crowd. The crowd looked at them. Daniel recognized faces among the drivers. Some of them were the husbands of the women standing at the station, the brothers of the porters, sons of merchants. Garrick had gathered those who had lost their jobs because of the road, or thought they had. They were angry people, but not strangers. One of the coachmen stepped forward. He was holding a torch. He shouted that they had come to burn down the station, that the road had taken their bread away, that enough was enough. A woman stepped out of the crowd at the station, a porter's wife. She said her husband used to be a coachman, but now he works at the station and earns twice as much and doesn't leave home for 3 weeks every month. The coachman with the torch fell silent. Another man stepped forward, an old man from Devyatka. He said that before the road, there had been 4 houses in Devyatka. Now there are 40. Before the road was built, his grandchildren used to walk barefoot. Now they wear boots. He said he wouldn't let them burn down the station, and that if anyone tried, they'd have to step over the old man. The coachman stood there in silence. The torches were burning out. Then one of them threw his torch to the ground. He turned and walked away. The second followed him. A third. By dawn, not a single coachman with a torch remained at the 9 station. But Garrick didn't give up. He came in person. Not to the 9, to the main station in Brayshire, in a carriage, with 10 horsemen. At dawn on the 3rd day. Daniel was waiting for him on the platform, alone. Elise wanted to stand beside him. He asked her to leave. This was his conversation. Garrick stepped out of the carriage. He was dressed for travel, unarmed. He walked through the crowd, which parted before him. People knew him. They feared him. But they didn't hate him. He wasn't a villain. He was a man who protected his own, as best he could. He stepped onto the platform and stood before Daniel. They looked at each other. Garrick spoke first. He said that Daniel had won, that his drivers hadn't burned the stations, that the people had stood as a wall and wouldn't let them through. He said that even his own men had stopped listening to him, because half of them were already working on the road, and the other half wanted to work. He said that the Calder-Vespri War had stalled. Both armies were stranded in the field without supplies. Calder couldn't get grain because the supply line was blocked. Vespri couldn't get grain because the supply trains weren't leaving the cities where everyone was busy standing at the stations. Both sides had sent envoys to Brayshire. Negotiations would begin tomorrow. Garrick fell silent. Then he said something that Daniel would remember forever. He said that Daniel hadn't beaten him. Daniel had beaten time, and time always comes back. Daniel asked what he meant. Garrick said that right now people are standing at the stations because the road gave them bread. But in 10 years, they'll forget who gave it to them. In 20, they'll think it's always been that way. In 30, they'll start complaining. And in 50, someone will decide they can do without the road. And everything will start all over again. Daniel said that was exactly why he was building a school. Not a road, a school. So that in 50 years, there would be people who remembered why. Garrick looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded and said he wanted a job. Daniel hadn't expected that. Garrick said he had 80,000 people who needed something to do. Coachmen, guards, grooms, people who know how to work on the road. Not on the railroad, perhaps, but on the road. They know the routes. They know the towns. They know the people. They could become delivery drivers from the stations, the ones who take cargo from the tracks to the customer's door. The last mile, the one the locomotive can't cover. Daniel listened and realized that Garrick had come up with in a single night what he himself had been thinking about for months. The last mile, the most expensive part of any shipment, delivering cargo from the station to the village, from the station to the store, from the station to the house. The rails are the spine, but ribs are needed. And those very drivers whom he had nearly left out of work would be the ribs. Daniel held out his hand. Garrick shook it, firmly, without a smile, but with a respect that hadn't been there before. Negotiations between Calder and Vespri lasted 3 days. Not because the parties didn't want peace, because the parties wanted to look as if peace had come at great cost to them. In the end, they signed a convention. Marchwood became a joint territory. Both sides maintained garrisons, but tariffs were unified, and grain flowed freely. A separate clause of the convention recognized the railroad as neutral territory. Neither side had the right to use it for military purposes without the consent of both parties. It was a precedent, the first in the history of Irina. Lady Sage had secured this clause. She spoke with her father, with the Vespri ambassadors, with Mayor Aldrich. She used every connection she had, and she succeeded. When the convention was signed, Daniel launched the line. The locomotive blew its whistle at Brasher Station, and off it went, down the tracks, with a load, for the first time in a week. People at the stations were shouting, crying, hugging each other. Daniel stood on the platform and watched as the Iron Man headed toward Colden. Elise walked over and stood beside him. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, close, her shoulder brushed against his. He didn't move away. The Four Kingdoms sent envoys to Brasher over the next month. Everyone wanted to discuss the tracks. Everyone wanted a line to their own territory. Everyone wanted to sign a convention on a standard gauge. Daniel sat in on the negotiations and explained what standard gauge was. 4 feet, 8.5 inches. Why exactly that measurement? Because that's what the engineer decided. The envoys exchanged glances. Then they agreed. The Northern Ring was born on paper before it was built. Garrick's coachmen came to burn down the stations, but the people standing on the platforms wouldn't let them. Garrick admitted defeat and offered his coachmen as last-mile delivery drivers. The Calder-Vespri War ground to a halt without supplies, and the parties signed a convention recognizing the railroad as neutral territory. The Four Kingdoms began negotiations over the North. A year had passed since the convention, Daniel's 3rd year in the world of Irene. The Brasher-Colden-Tainholm line was completed. 60 miles, 3 stations, 2 bridges, a depot in Brasher, a depot in Tainholm. 4 locomotives. The iron was still ran. Old, patched up, loud, but it ran. The hammer hauled heavy freight trains. The 3rd and 4th locomotives were built by the school's graduates, under GU's supervision, without Daniel's blueprints, using their own. The school had graduated its first 12 engineers. Tobin from Holdfast was the best. He designed bridges. Daniel looked at his blueprints and saw lines he himself would never have drawn, not because Tobin was better, because Tobin thought differently. He had grown up in this world. He knew its materials, its stone, his wood, his iron. He didn't try to build a bridge from a 21st century textbook. He built a bridge from what was at hand, and the bridge stood. Daniel realized that day that his task was complete, not to build a road, to teach others to build. The network grew, not quickly, but unstoppably. 2 new branches to the west, 1 to the east toward the coast. The northern ring was completed by the fall of the 3rd year. 4 kingdoms linked by a single track. Grain traveled from south to north all winter long. The price of bread in the northern cities fell by half. Villages that had starved for 3 years in a row stocked up on grain for the first time in a long while, enough grain to last 2 winters. Farmers in the south gained a market. Prices for their grain rose. They stopped going bankrupt. A simple thing, rails, sleepers, a steam locomotive, and the world began to breathe. Daniel stood at the Brasher station and watched the train depart for Tainholm. 5 cars, 20 tons of grain. The engineer was one of the school's students, a 22-year-old guy. He blew the whistle with confidence, as if he'd done it 1,000 times. The train set off. The rails hummed and fell silent. Daniel stood on the platform. There was no one around. Everyone was busy. Elise was negotiating with the ambassadors of the 5th Kingdom, which wanted to join the ring. Ji-U was overseeing the construction of a new foundry, a real one, not a shed by the dock, a plant with 3 rolling mills and 2 furnaces. Ha-In had gone south to survey a route across the mountain range, with 2 assistants and a knife. Maddie managed the entire northern branch from Colden, 300 workers under her command. She hadn't had a drink in 3 years. Last summer, she traveled to Holdfast to see her mother. By train. On tracks that didn't exist the last time she saw her mother. Yeren returned to Tainholm, not as an exiled princess, as the crown's representative for railway affairs. She negotiated, she approved routes, issued permits. She was 19. Her brothers, the heirs, stopped ignoring her. They began to consult with her. Lady Sage lived in Brasher. Her sons attended engineering school. The eldest was 8. He built model bridges out of twigs and glue. The youngest took apart and reassembled a small, alcohol-powered locomotive that Daniel had made 3 years earlier. The model still worked. Sage smiled more often. Not often, but more often. The coldness in her face melted slowly, like ice on a spring river. Garrick Vaughan headed the last-mile delivery service. 8,000 carters worked out of the stations. They delivered cargo to villages and towns where the rails hadn't reached yet. They earned a living. Their families ate. Garrick came to the Brasher station every Monday. He got a report from Maddie. He checked the schedule. He left. They didn't become friends. But they became something like colleagues. People who do the same work from different sides. Master Sun was forging in the foundry, silently, as always. But now there were 4 apprentices standing beside him, and he was teaching them. Not with words, with his hands, as best he could. Ji-Woo saw this and said nothing. Only one evening did she bring her father a new leather apron, with his initials on it. Alvin built rail cars in the workshop at the depot. 6 carpenters under his supervision. He still didn't speak. He still worked better than anyone else. One evening, Daniel went down to the basement of the Brasher Library. He came here from time to time, looking for clues of the one who came before him. The one who, 500 years ago, had drawn a steam locomotive in an engraving. That evening, he found something new. Not an engraving, a medallion. A sealed copper disc in a niche behind a bookshelf. He pried it open with a knife. Inside was a scrap of paper, crumbled at the edges. On the paper was a single line, written in letters that didn't exist in this world. Russian letters. Daniel read them and his hands trembled. Lay the track. I'll follow. The handwriting wasn't his, but it was similar, confident, engineering-like. The handwriting of a man who was used to writing on blueprints. Daniel sat in the dusty basement, holding the scrap of paper. 500 years. Someone had been here 500 years ago. Someone from his world. Someone who knew what a rail was. And that someone had written a note. Not to himself. to the next one, to the one who would come after. Daniel put the medallion in his pocket. He went upstairs. He stepped out onto the street. Evening Brayshire hummed all around him. The city had changed in 3 years. It had grown. It had grown stronger. There were streetlights by the station, new ones, oil lamps. Elise had insisted that the city council install them. A new neighborhood was being built next to the depot. Houses for workers, a school, a clinic. The city was growing around the station like a tree around a trunk. Daniel walked down the street, thinking about the note. Lay the track, I'll follow. Who wrote this? The one who was here 500 years ago and whose engraving had rotted in the basement. The one who was stopped. Who stopped him, and why? He didn't know the answers, not yet, but he knew the answers existed. Somewhere in this world, in basements, in ruins, in notes written by dead engineers in a language that doesn't exist here. He was walking down the street when Elise called out to him. She was standing by the office with papers in her hands. Her red hair looked coppery in the evening light, a quill behind her ear, an ink stain on her cheek. She said that the Fifth Kingdom had signed the convention, a single gauge, a single standard. Daniel nodded. Good. She said that the ambassadors from the Sixth Kingdom would arrive next week. Daniel nodded again. She paused. Then she said he hadn't eaten today. He said he'd forgotten. She said she knew, and held out an apple to him. He took it. Their fingers touched, for a second. Elise pulled her hand away, quickly. Daniel stood there with the apple and thought that in 3 years, this woman had turned his blueprints into a business, his dream into an accounting department, his madness into numbers that convinced kings. Without her, there would be nothing. He told her that, out loud, for the first time. Elise stood there in silence, a quill behind her ear, an ink stain on her cheek. She said she had to go. Papers, bills, schedules. She turned away. And Daniel said, "Wait." She stopped. He said he wanted to show her something. He took a locket out of his pocket, opened it, showed her a note. Elise couldn't read it. The letters were foreign to this world. But she looked at his face, at his eyes, and realized it was important. She asked what it said. He translated. Lay the track, I'll follow. Elise was silent. Then she asked who wrote it. Daniel said he didn't know, but he wants to find out. She asked what he was going to do. He said he was going to build, rail after rail, mile after mile, until he connects all of Iron, until the tracks reach every town and every village, until war becomes pointless because everyone is connected and everyone depends on one another. And while he builds, he'll search for traces of those who came before him, traces of those who stopped them, and traces of the one who wrote the note and promised to follow. Elise listened. Then she said it sounded like a lifetime's work. Daniel said it was. She said that in that case, he'd need a good accountant. He looked at her. She looked at him, an ink stain on her cheek, a feather behind her ear, red hair in the light of the street lamp. He smiled. She smiled back, and they walked down the street toward the office, side by side, shoulder to shoulder. Behind them, Brayshire Station hummed in the evening twilight. The locomotive stood in the depot with its boiler cooled down, old, patched up, with a dent on its side where an old woman from Colden had patted it 3 years ago. The tracks ran from the station in both directions, south to Colden, north to Tainholm, west to the new branches, east to the coast that was still waiting. The network was growing, without Daniel, faster than with him. His students were building it. His engineers were designing it. His blacksmiths were forging it. His engineers were driving the trains. His ticket clerks were selling tickets. His track workers were repairing the tracks. A world that 3 years ago was suffocating from its own slowness was beginning to breathe. Not because a hero had arrived, because the hero had taught others, and they carried on. Daniel walked down Brayshire's evening street beside the woman who believed in his dream. In his pocket lay a locket with a note from the dead engineer. In his mind was a map of all of Iron, with lines that did not yet exist. In his hand was an apple he had never taken a bite out of.